Malcolm pressed a declaration into my hand, while his pregnant mistress stood beside him outside our daughter's adoption courtroom. My 9-year-old daughter, Evie, was still wearing the daddy's girl badge she had made for the hearing. When I asked why he had brought another woman to the day he was supposed to become her father, he looked at Evie and said, "She's giving me a real child. I won't adopt someone else's." Evie pulled off the badge. Malcolm thought the hearing would end with my signature. The judge walked in while that line was still blank. "I hope you are doing well tonight. Stay with Evie and me to see what happened after that courtroom door opened, and subscribe to Stories by Night so you do not miss the rest of our story." That morning, Evie sat at the largest work table in Carter Community Art Studio, with a black marker in one hand and a ruler pressed beneath the other. The room still smelled faintly of tempera paint and the citrus cleaner I used after weekend classes. Sunlight came through the front windows and fell across 53 versions of the same name, Evie Reed. Some were written in careful print, some leaned to the right in the looping cursive. She had only recently begun learning. She counted them twice, touching each line with the end of the marker. 53, she said. "That is lucky, right?" I asked why 53. She shrugged as if the answer should have been obvious. Because 50. 2 felt unfinished. Then she looked down at the name again and smiled. "Will Mrs. Tan call me Evie Reed after today? Or do we have to wait for another paper?" I told her we would ask the court what came next. It was the safest answer available, but it was not the answer I had been giving her for months. For months, I had said today would make everything official. I had helped her choose the navy dress folded over the back of a studio chair. I had promised we would stop for lemon cake afterward. I had let her make a new display label for the school art show with Reed, written beneath her first name, even though the teacher had agreed not to use it until the adoption was complete. Evie's biological father had disappeared when she was 15 months old. After a documented search, valid notice, and a separate proceeding, the court had terminated his parental rights in September 2025. Malcolm and I filed the step-parent adoption that December, so by May, his continuing consent was the final human choice still standing between Evie and the name she had practiced. I had also watched her cut a small oval from white cardstock, paint a blue border around it, and letter "Daddy's Girl" across the center in silver ink. When she pinned it above her heart, she turned toward the studio mirror and straightened her shoulders. "Too much?" she asked. "No," I said. "He is going to love it." Malcolm had not come home the night before. At 11:40, he texted that a work issue had kept him in San Jose and that he would meet us at the courthouse. The message contained no apology and no question about Evie. I read it 3 times, then placed my phone face down because she was still awake in the next room. At breakfast, she asked whether Malcolm might be preparing a surprise. I said he probably wanted the morning to feel special. The words came too quickly. By then, I had become practiced at turning his absences into softer explanations. When he postponed the first adoption meeting, I told her his project deadline had changed. When he delayed the background forms, I said the attorney needed corrections. When he missed a home interview, I blamed the court calendar. Every reason had sounded possible by itself. Together, they formed a pattern I refused to name. 3 months earlier, Malcolm had attended Evie's school exhibition in a charcoal suit, arriving just before the doors opened and leaving before cleanup. Evie had taken his hand and introduced him to her teacher as her dad. He had smiled for photographs, praised her painted city skyline, and stood beneath a banner that said, "Families build our world." When the teacher mentioned updating Evie's display label after the adoption, Malcolm kissed the top of her head and said, "Soon." In the parking lot, I reminded him that 2 forms still needed his signature. His expression changed before we reached the car. He said he would not discuss legal paperwork in front of children. I apologized, though Evie was already 20 feet away, showing a friend the ribbon she had won. That public tenderness was not entirely invented. 2 years earlier, when Evie was afraid to ride without training wheels, Malcolm had run beside her bicycle until she crossed the whole studio parking lot. He had knelt in front of her afterward and said a father was the person who stayed close enough to catch you, not the person whose blood you carried. I remembered that sentence whenever his paperwork stalled, because believing it allowed me to treat his best moments as proof and his evasions as temporary failures. At the studio, I watched Evie slide the 53 signatures into a clear folder. I should have told her that signatures did not make promises safe. I should have admitted that Malcolm's actions had been asking a question his words kept avoiding. Instead, I zipped her dress, fixed the clasp on her shoes, and helped her attach the badge. She tucked the folder against her chest as we locked the studio. "Do you think he practiced too?" she asked. "Practiced what?" "Signing as my dad." I opened the car door for her. "He has signed plenty of papers already." Again, technically true. Again, not an answer. The Alameda County Courthouse was busy without feeling loud. Shoes crossed polished floors. Attorneys spoke in low voices near elevator banks. Families waited with folders held against their laps, as though paper could keep their hands from shaking. Marta Bell met us outside the assigned courtroom. She had interviewed us twice during the step-parent adoption investigation and had spoken to Malcolm alone. That morning, her usual calm seemed slightly strained. She asked whether Malcolm was parking. I said he was meeting us there. Evie checked the clock above the doors. Then she smoothed the face of her badge with 2 fingers. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I called once, but hung up before the first ring completed. I did not want Evie to watch me chase him into the day he had promised her. Marta offered to ask the clerk whether the matter could be held a little longer. I thanked her and said Malcolm would arrive. Evie opened her folder and looked at the names she had written. "Maybe 53 was too many," she said. I crouched in front of her. "The number has nothing to do with whether he comes." "I know." She rubbed the badge again. "I just do not want it to look messy when he sees it." I started to tell her it looked perfect. The elevator bell sounded before I could finish. Malcolm stepped out first. He wore the same dark blue suit he had worn to Evie's exhibition, but he was not carrying flowers or the leather folder we had used for the adoption papers. A woman walked beside him with one hand beneath the curve of her stomach. Jocelyn Pike. I knew her face from a company holiday photograph Malcolm had once shown me. She had been standing 2 rows behind him, smiling toward someone outside the frame. Now she was 22 weeks pregnant and holding a thick cream envelope against her side. Evie stood. For a second, her face brightened because she had only seen Malcolm. Then her eyes moved to Jocelyn's stomach. Malcolm did not bend to greet her. He did not touch her shoulder or mention the badge. He looked at me and said, "We need to handle this efficiently." I asked who Jocelyn was, though by then the answer was already visible in the space between them. Malcolm said our marriage had been over for months and that the adoption would not continue. His voice remained level, almost bored, as if he were correcting an appointment time. Jocelyn opened the cream envelope. Malcolm removed 2 documents, pressed the joint declaration into my hand, and said the request to withdraw had already been filed. "Sign this so we can close everything cleanly." I looked at Evie. She was still standing with her folder pressed to her dress. "Why did you let us come here?" I asked. "Why did you tell her this was happening if you had already decided?" Malcolm glanced toward the courtroom doors. "I did not tell her. You did." I reminded him of every form he had signed, every interview he had attended, every time he had let her call him Dad. His mouth tightened. I held up the declaration he had just forced into my hand. "You prepared this while telling her today was certain." Jocelyn shifted behind him. "Naomi," Malcolm said, "do not turn this into a scene." "She is 9, I said. "You brought her here to be rejected in a hallway." He exhaled and looked directly at Evie. "She's giving me a real child. I won't adopt someone else's." The sentence did not sound dramatic in his voice. That made it worse. He said it as a conclusion he believed no reasonable person could dispute. Evie looked down at the badge. Her fingers found the clasp behind the cardstock, but they were shaking too hard to open it. She pulled until the pin tore loose from the fabric. Then she held the badge in her fist and looked at me. "Mommy, do I have no dad again?" I went to my knees and wrapped both arms around her. I could feel the folder trapped between us and the hard edge of the badge against my wrist. Over her shoulder, I saw the courtroom side door open. The clerk stepped out. Judge Maribel Stone was approaching from inside chambers. I held Evie closer and kept my voice low. "Remember what you just said before the judge walks in." Malcolm gave a short, humorless laugh. "That is exactly the kind of performance I am talking about." He pointed toward the declaration already in my hand. "The withdrawal is filed. Sign the joint statement." The clerk called the matter and asked everyone to enter. I looked at the first page. Joint declaration regarding circumstances of withdrawal and costs. Beneath the title were signature lines for Malcolm and me. His was signed, "Mine was blank." Inside the courtroom, Malcolm spoke before I had fully seated Evie beside me. He told Judge Stone that both parties had agreed the adoption should end and that he had filed a request to withdraw. He placed the signed request on counsel table and referred to the document in my hand as our joint explanation. Judge Stone looked at me. "Miss Carter, did you sign that declaration?" "No." "Did you agree to its contents?" "I have not read it." Malcolm began to say the language was standard. Judge Stone lifted one hand. "Mr. Reed, the court can accept your withdrawal. It cannot turn an unsigned accusation into a joint statement." She asked him one direct question. Did he still freely and voluntarily wish to adopt Evie? Malcolm said no. The answer ended the future I had promised my daughter. Judge Stone explained that the adoption could not be completed without his continuing consent. She did not shame him, and she did not pretend the law could force love into existence. Then her attention moved to a sealed memorandum beside the clerk. Judge Stone said the court investigator had filed a supplemental report that morning concerning a prior paternity and support matter. Malcolm had not disclosed in his adoption declarations. She did not name the minor child. She said the record showed a dependent and an existing support obligation that required clarification before the court could close the file accurately. Malcolm's face changed for the first time. Not much, but enough. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered, then told Judge Stone the report was a mistaken identity and asked her to dismiss everything immediately. She declined. The adoption would not be finalized. The request to withdraw, the unsigned declaration, and the supplemental memorandum would remain part of a short continued proceeding so the record could state what had happened and what had not. She made clear that the court was not deciding child support, divorce, or criminal liability. It was deciding whether Malcolm's withdrawal could be recorded as a mutual account when I had never agreed to it. The clerk collected the documents. Malcolm watched the blank line leave my hand. Beside me, Evie had not cried. Her fist remained closed around the badge. When I touched her fingers, she flinched. A bright bead of blood had appeared where the loose pin had punctured her palm. I wrapped her hand in a clean tissue from my purse. She stared at the white paper, turning red, and whispered, "I do not want his name anymore." I told her she did not have to decide anything that day. It was the first honest promise I had made since morning. Outside the courtroom, Malcolm caught up with us near the elevators. Jocelyn stayed several feet behind him. "The request alone ends the adoption," he said quietly. "You cannot stop that." "I know." "Then sign the declaration and stop creating unnecessary costs." I folded it once and handed it back. "I am not signing something I have not read." His expression remained calm, but his voice dropped. "If you refuse, I will tell the court you supplied the false family history. I will seek fees. I will seek sanctions. And I will make sure the divorce record shows you used Evie to pressure me into this." Evie heard him. I felt her fingers close around mine. Malcolm had just rejected her as someone else's child. Now he was preparing to make her the reason he had lied. I did not answer Malcolm. I pushed the elevator button and kept my body between him and Evie until the doors opened. He said my name once more, quieter this time, as though lowering his voice could turn a threat into reasonable advice. Jocelyn stood behind him with one hand resting beneath her stomach. She looked at Evie's bleeding palm, then at the floor. Neither of them asked whether she was all right. The elevator arrived. I guided Evie inside and pressed the button for the ground floor, but she pulled on my sleeve before the doors closed. My hand hurts. The tissue around her palm had already soaked through. I pressed the button to hold the doors and took her to the nearest restroom instead. Evie stood beside the sink while I ran cold water over the small puncture. The wound was not deep, but the skin around it had turned red. She watched the water carry away a thin line of blood. Her badge lay beside the faucet, with the bent pin sticking out from the back. "I can fix the clasp," I said. "I do not want you to." Her answer was immediate. She did not sound sad. She sounded tired. I turned off the water and dried her hand with a paper towel. "All right." She looked at our reflection in the mirror. Her navy dress was wrinkled where I had held her. The place above her heart showed 2 tiny holes where the badge had been pinned. "Why did you say it was certain?" The question struck harder than anything Malcolm had said outside the courtroom. I reached for the small first aid pouch in my purse and opened an adhesive bandage. "We should talk about this at home. You said today was definitely happening." "I know. You said the judge would sign it and then I could use his name." "I know what I said." "Did you know he did not want to?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Evie's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did you think he might not?" I placed the bandage across her palm and pressed the edges down. I could have told her Malcolm had lied to both of us. I could have listed every form he signed and every promise he made. All of that was true, but it would not answer what she was asking. "I knew he had delayed it before," I said. "I did not know he was going to do this." "That is not the same question." She was 9 years old, but she understood the difference between not knowing and refusing to look. "I am not ready to give you a good answer yet," I said. "I need to think about what I should have noticed. I do not want to tell you something just because it makes me sound better." Evie looked down at the bandage. "Then do not promise what you are going to say." "I will not." My phone vibrated inside my purse. Malcolm's name appeared on the screen. "The declaration protects both of us." A second message arrived before I could close the first. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." Then another. "Sign it today, and we can keep private matters private." Not one message mentioned Evie. He did not ask why her hand had been bleeding, or whether she had heard everything. He spoke as though the only injury in the courthouse was a document left unsigned. I silenced the phone and placed it back in my purse. Evie picked up the badge by its edge. "Can we go home now?" "Yes." We made it halfway through the courthouse lobby, before my phone vibrated again. I expected Malcolm. The name on the screen was Jocelyn Pike. I stopped beside a row of metal benches and opened the message. "Malcolm told me you knew the adoption had been canceled weeks ago. I did not know she was expecting it to happen today." I read it twice. Jocelyn had known she would be appearing in front of a child. She had still agreed to come. That did not make her innocent. But her message revealed something Malcolm had not planned for me to learn yet. He had told her I knew the hearing was already over. He had told me the hearing was proceeding normally. He had let Evie choose a dress, make a badge, and carry 53 practice signatures into a courtroom while assuring another woman that we had already accepted the truth. I did not reply. I took a screenshot, then forwarded the message to an email address Malcolm could not access. At home, Evie went directly to her room. I heard the top drawer of her dresser open. When I checked on her a few minutes later, the badge was lying inside beside 2 friendship bracelets and a ribbon from the school art show. She had not thrown it away. She had placed it face down. The clear folder containing her practice signatures was still beneath her arm. She carried it to the kitchen, removed the page from the front, and looked at all 53 versions of Evie Reed. Then she took down the matching display label from the refrigerator. I watched without speaking. She turned both sheets face down on the table. "Do not put them in the trash," she said. "I will not. I do not want to look at them." "All right." She went to her room and closed the door. Not slammed. Closed. That quiet movement frightened me more than a tantrum would have. I sat at the kitchen table with the courthouse papers spread before me. In the adoption forms, Malcolm had signed statements saying he understood that adoption created a lifelong parent-child relationship and that he wanted the law to recognize the family we already lived as. The joint declaration told the opposite story. It said I had pressured him, controlled the family history answers, and assured him that no prior obligation needed disclosure. A paragraph near the bottom asked me to confirm that neither of us had hidden material information. My signature would not merely acknowledge his withdrawal. It would make his concealment sound like my mistake. A parent from the studio gave me Priya Shah's number. Priya called back after I explained that the hearing had ended with an unsigned declaration and a sealed memorandum concerning a prior paternity case. She separated the two legal questions immediately. Malcolm could withdraw his consent, but he could not make an unsigned accusation into our shared account. The request to withdraw ended his participation. The joint declaration tried to assign the history, costs, and blame. "So he does not need my signature to stop the adoption," I said. "No," Priya answered. "He needs it to say you agreed with his explanation." She instructed me to preserve every page, text, email, calendar entry, and draft without editing anything. She also told me not to search for the child connected to the prior case until we knew what information the court had authorized. Priya arranged a video consultation for that afternoon. Before ending the call, she repeated two limits. A complete record mattered more than a flattering one, and neither of us would contact or search for the unidentified minor. Then she told me not to confront Malcolm again without advice. My phone rang the moment she disconnected. "Malcolm." I stared at his name until the screen went dark. It rang again. I called Priya back. "He is calling." Priya told me I could answer if I felt able, but I had to identify her before she listened. She opened the video link on my laptop and said I should ask one question, avoid accusations, and let Malcolm decide how much he wanted to reveal. When I placed my phone on speaker, he answered with an irritated, "What?" I said, "Before we continue, my attorney, Priya Shah, is listening." Malcolm was silent for a beat. "You hired a lawyer already?" "I want you to explain the prior paternity case." Malcolm was silent again. "Is there a child?" I asked. "The matter was resolved years ago." "That does not answer me." "There was a paternity proceeding. Current support is handled automatically through payroll. It has nothing to do with you or Evie." Malcolm's salary had always gone into an account in his name, and he transferred a fixed amount into our joint checking each month. I had seen only a few payroll summaries when we applied for the mortgage. One contained a deduction-coded GARN, order beneath taxes and retirement. Malcolm called it an old obligation tied to a dispute before we met, and I assumed it was debt repayment or a judgment from a failed investment. When I asked once, he said it was embarrassing and private. I had accepted that, instead of asking to see the underlying order. "You have been paying support for a child throughout our marriage?" I said the matter is handled. "You wrote that you had no children and no support obligations." I wrote what my attorney told me was relevant. Priya made a small note on the screen, but did not interrupt. "What is the child's name?" I asked. "That information is none of your business. You asked a court to make you Evie's father." And I withdrew. "You lived in this house while support came out of your paycheck, and you never told me the money was for your child. I do not need permission to manage obligations that began before our marriage. This is not about permission. It is exactly about control. You are angry that I finally made a decision you could not manage." I wanted to shout that he had abandoned Evie in a courthouse. I wanted to ask whether the other child had ever waited for him with a handmade badge. Priya lifted one finger toward the camera, reminding me not to chase the argument he wanted. Did you disclose the paternity case to the adoption investigator? I asked. I dealt with what was necessary. That is not an answer either. His voice hardened. Sign the declaration. I will not discuss a sealed family matter over the phone. He ended the call. After Malcolm ended the call, Priya summarized only what he had admitted. A paternity proceeding existed, support was still being withheld, and he knew about the obligation. The sealed memorandum did not entitle us to another family's private file or even the child's name. It established only that Malcolm Adrian Reed, with matching identifiers, had been a respondent in a Sacramento paternity and support matter, while declaring in this adoption that no such child or obligation existed. That contradiction was enough to change everything. I muted the laptop for a moment and stared at the fixed household transfer entries in our banking app. The same amount arrived every month, clean and ordinary, while the withheld support remained hidden upstream in an account Malcolm controlled. I had not uncovered a secret by noticing one dramatic payment. I had helped preserve it by accepting a system in which I knew only what he chose to move into our shared life. That realization frightened me, because it was not only about money. The adoption forms, his absences, and the courthouse plan had all depended on the same habit of letting Malcolm define what counted as relevant. I heard Evie's bedroom door open. She walked into the kitchen wearing soft gray pants and one of my old studio shirts. Her hair was still pinned from cord on one side and loose on the other. She stopped when she saw Priya on the laptop. Who is that? This is Miss Shaw. She is helping me understand the papers Malcolm wanted me to sign. Priya introduced herself simply, then asked whether Evie wanted privacy. Evie shook her head and climbed into the chair beside me. On the screen, Priya was explaining that we needed the original email containing the joint declaration. She said the date attached to the file might help establish when it had been created. Evie traced the edge of her bandage. "Is there another kid?" she asked. I closed the laptop halfway, but she placed her hand on the lid. "I heard you ask him." I glanced at Priya. She gave no instruction. This was not a legal question. It was mine to answer as her mother. "There is a court record involving another child," I said. "His child?" "It may be. The record is a paternity and support case, but I have not seen enough to tell you everything." "Is it a real child?" The words caught in my chest. "Every child is real. You know what I mean." I did. "Malcolm may have another biological child," I said. "I do not know the child's name. I do not know the whole history yet." Evie looked at the papers on the table. "So he already had what he said he wanted." "I do not know what he wanted." "Do not say you know later." "I will not." She looked directly at me. "Do not promise anything if you do not know." I wanted to tell her I promised. The word rose automatically, ready to soothe the space between us. I stopped myself. "You are right," I said. "I will tell you what I know. And I will tell you when I do not know." Evie nodded once. It was not forgiveness. It was permission to continue speaking. Priya asked me to reopen the laptop. She guided me through the email Malcolm had sent with the declaration attached. We downloaded the original file rather than a forwarded copy. The document properties showed it had been created on May 4th. I searched our text thread and found Malcolm's message from May 15th. "Everything is set for Monday. Tell Evie not to worry." The declaration blaming me had existed for 11 days when he sent that message. He had already prepared to abandon the adoption. He had simply needed Evie and me to arrive believing he would keep his promise. The joint declaration had been waiting 11 days before Malcolm brought it to the courthouse. Priya placed it beside the adoption petition and asked me to read only what he had said about himself. In the petition, Malcolm described a loving father-child bond built over 6 years and accepted the permanent duties of adoption. In the later declaration, he described himself as a reluctant husband pushed through a process he had never wanted. His oversized M and the underline beneath read appeared on both documents. "He can change his mind," Priya said. "He cannot change who supplied the facts or what he knew when he signed them." Malcolm had completed most of the sections concerning his employment, residences, marriages, children, legal proceedings, and support obligations because, as he often reminded me, he worked with risk forms for a living. Priya asked whether I had reviewed the question about other children. I remembered standing behind Malcolm at our dining table, while Evie made paper flowers on the floor. The form asked him to list every biological, adopted, or legally recognized child, and any support obligation. He had entered none. I had asked whether an old legal dispute belonged there. Malcolm's fingers stopped above the keyboard. "That was never proven," he said. When I asked what had not been proven, he answered, "Nothing relevant to this adoption," closed the section, and asked whether I wanted takeout. His answer had felt incomplete. I also knew pressing him would produce another exhausting argument about trust, and the adoption finally seemed to be moving. I chose peace at the table. Now, the cost of that peace sat in front of me. I told Priya exactly what had happened. Malcolm had never identified a paternity case or support order, and I had repeated his answer when the investigator asked about family history. Priya did not excuse me. She separated what I should have questioned from information. Only Malcolm possessed. "We need evidence, not conclusions," she said. We searched the emails and attachments Malcolm had sent me during the adoption process. He had circulated 8 versions of the questionnaire for review. We did not enter a private attorney account or open communications addressed only to counsel. Every file we preserved was one Malcolm had sent directly to me or placed in the folder we both used. The earliest version left the child question blank. The next said none. Another contained his comment beside the support section. "Remove. Not applicable." Priya preserved the original attachments and recorded each file name, email date, creation date, modification date, and source. A later version contained another comment beside the description of his bond with Evie. "Make stronger. Show existing father-child bond." The final sentence said he had functioned as her father in every meaningful way and wished to make that commitment permanent. He had not merely signed language, I supplied. He had strengthened the promise while removing the history that contradicted it. The next morning, I drove Evie to school. Her bandaged hand rested in her lap. The clear folder containing the 53 signatures remained face down on our kitchen table. Mrs. Tan met us near the classroom door. She knew the adoption hearing had been scheduled because Evie had asked about using Reed on the label for the upcoming family art display. "I kept the official records as Carter," she said quietly. "The other label was only a draft. We can leave everything exactly as it is." Evie nodded. Mrs. Tan held up the draft display card. Evie Reed appeared in blue letters, beneath a small photograph of Evie's painting. "Would you like me to destroy this?" Evie looked at me. I started to say she did not have to decide yet. Her expression changed before I finished. "I can answer," she said. I stopped. "Sorry." She turned back to Mrs. Tan. "Please use Carter." Mrs. Tan placed the draft inside a folder, rather than tearing it in front of her. "Carter it is." As we entered the classroom, a girl named Sophie noticed the 2 holes in Evie's navy dress, which she had insisted on wearing again. "Where is your daddy's girl badge?" "It broke," Evie said. I touched her shoulder. "It was damaged at the courthouse." Evie stepped away from my hand. "I said it broke." Sophie glanced between us and hurried toward her desk. In the hallway, I crouched beside Evie. "I was trying to help." "You were changing what I said." "I only explained. I did not ask you to." Her voice remained low, but the anger in it was clear. I thought of all the times I had explained Malcolm for her. He was late because work was difficult. He postponed because the court was busy. He missed dinner because he was tired. Every explanation had filled a silence he created. "I am sorry," I said. You can decide what you tell people. Evie adjusted her backpack. Even if it sounds bad? Even then. She entered the classroom without hugging me goodbye. I sat in my car for several minutes before driving to the studio. Carter Community Art Studio usually felt safest before classes began. The tables were clean, jars of brushes stood in neat rows, and unfinished murals waited without demanding explanations. That morning, every blank surface reminded me of the line Malcolm expected me to sign. At 10:17, Jocelyn called. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then, I remembered Priya's instructions. Preserve communication. Do not argue. Let people reveal what they know. I answered and opened a notebook. I do not want to fight with you, Jocelyn said. You came to my daughter's adoption hearing with my husband. I know how it looked. It looked exactly like what it was. She was silent for a moment. Malcolm told me you threatened to destroy his career if he did not go through with the adoption. I wrote the sentence down. What did he say I would do? He said you would contact his company, claim he had misrepresented family information, and involve me. Did he tell you that before or after he prepared the joint declaration? Another silence. You know about that document? He asked me to hold the envelope. That was not my question. He said it was only necessary if you caused a scene. I gripped the pen harder. When did he tell you that? A few days before the hearing. Did you know he had already filed forms saying he wanted to adopt Evie? He said you made him sign them. He attended a private interview without me. I did not know that. Did he tell you Evie still believed the adoption was happening? Jocelyn breathed slowly into the phone. He told me you had explained everything to her. She practiced his last name 3 times that morning. I did not know. You knew she would be at the courthouse. Yes. You knew Malcolm planned to announce your pregnancy in front of her. He said she needed to understand there was no future in pretending. I set down the pen before I snapped it. You stood there and let a 9-year-old be used to make his point. I am not asking you to forgive me. Good. She said Malcolm had described me as unstable whenever I lost control of a situation. He said the hearing would prove I cared more about winning than about Evie. Did he tell you what he planned to say to her? No. I did not know whether I believed her. I wrote down her answer without deciding. Before ending the call, I asked one final question. Did you see him edit the declaration? No, but he talked about changing the part that made it sound as though he was responsible for the false information. He said his lawyer's first draft was too neutral. After the call, I returned to the attachments Malcolm had emailed me. The joint declaration appeared in 4 versions that had been circulated for my signature. The first was relatively brief, and stated only that Malcolm no longer wished to proceed and that both parties would bear their own costs. The next version added a paragraph, saying the adoption had been initiated primarily at my insistence. The third added language claiming I had supplied the family history. A comment bubble beside that paragraph contained one instruction. Need clear separation from representations made in petition. Malcolm's initials appeared beside it. He had not only planned to blame me, he had revised the language until the blame was unmistakable. I sent the files to Priya. That afternoon she called and said Malcolm's attorney had contacted her. He proposed a temporary agreement. I could remain in the townhouse with Evie for 6 months. Malcolm would continue contributing toward the mortgage during that period. In return, I would sign the joint declaration, waive any requests that he pay my adoption-related legal fees, and agree not to oppose his description of the withdrawal. What happens after 6 months? I asked. We would address possession through the divorce process, or a further agreement. And the studio? His proposal does not protect the studio directly. The studio lease was separate, but its stability depended on my income. Without Malcolm's mortgage contribution, I could not maintain the townhouse, legal fees, and every studio expense indefinitely. For a moment, the offer felt like relief. 6 months would give Evie time to finish the school term. It would keep her bedroom, her familiar route, and the backyard where she painted at the outdoor table. It would give me time to rebuild savings. All I had to do was sign a story in which Malcolm's deception became my pressure. Priya did not tell me what to choose. "This is not a fake choice," she said. "Refusing may create real financial strain. We can request temporary family court orders concerning the house, mortgage, and unusual transfers, but there are no guarantees, and it will take work. If I sign, can we still show the other documents?" "Yes, but he will argue that you accepted his account after the fact. Your signature would not erase earlier evidence. It would complicate it." I pictured Evie asking me not to promise what I did not know. "I am not signing today. That is different from saying never." "I know." It was the first financial decision I made, without pretending courage removed the cost. The next morning, I reviewed every studio expense. I postponed the purchase of new pottery wheels. I canceled my participation in a large summer mural project because the upfront materials and subcontractor payments would have emptied most of my emergency fund before the client's first installment arrived. The project coordinator was disappointed. She warned me the city might choose another studio for future work. I thanked her and accepted the risk. I reduced 2 evening classes, combined supply orders, and told my assistant I might need to shorten her hours temporarily. Saying the words made me feel as though Malcolm had entered the studio and begun removing pieces of it. The retainer for Priya was $7,500. I transferred most of my $9,000 emergency fund and arranged a payment plan for future work. Then Malcolm moved $18,000 from our joint checking account into an account I could not see. The transfer was larger than any ordinary expense we had made that year. I called Priya before calling him. She told me to download the statement, preserve the transaction details, and avoid moving an equal amount in retaliation. "We document it," she said. "Then we seek temporary orders requiring disclosures and limiting unusual transfers. He is taking marital money. That may be how the court views it, but do not create a second disputed transfer by trying to correct it yourself." I opened a checking account in my own name and deposited only my studio income. I recorded the opening balance and sent Priya the confirmation. I did not empty shared accounts. I did not hide cash. I wanted a record I could explain without changing a single word. That evening, I packed Malcolm's toiletries, clothes, and work files from our bedroom. I labeled each box and photographed the contents before sealing it. Evie stood in the doorway. "Is he coming back?" "I do not know." "Are you making him leave?" "He has already been staying somewhere else. I am putting his things together so they are not mixed with ours." She watched me fold one of his shirts. My first dad disappeared too. I stopped. Evie remembered almost nothing about her biological father, but absence had still become part of how she understood men. One vanished before she could form memories. Another stayed long enough to build them, then walked into a courthouse and rejected her. "Will Malcolm disappear forever?" she asked. "I do not know what Malcolm will do." She stared at the box. I placed the shirt inside and went to her. "But I know what I will do," I said. "I will stay. I will tell you when I know something, and I will tell you when I do not." She did not ask me to promise. She leaned against me for 3 quiet seconds, then walked away. 2 days later, Priya asked me to inventory shared financial and legal records before Malcolm collected his remaining belongings. I began in the garage, where we stored tax files, mortgage statements, insurance records, and old project boxes. Malcolm had one gray archive box marked Family Documents. I remembered seeing it years earlier, but he always said it contained records from before our marriage. An old discovery index from a Sacramento law office was clipped beneath the lid, which explained why correspondence from the earlier case might have been copied and retained there. I did not open sealed mail or remove anything. I photographed the box where it sat and lifted the lid only far enough to identify the folders inside. A photocopy lay on top. It showed an opened envelope addressed to Malcolm at an apartment he had occupied before we met. The writing was uneven and oversized, each letter pressed hard into the paper. It was unmistakably a child's handwriting. I did not unfold the copied page beneath it. I photographed the envelope exactly where I found it, stepped away from the box, and called Priya. Priya told me not to touch anything else inside the gray archive box. I photographed the shelf, the box label, the discovery index, and the photocopied envelope exactly where I found them. A Sacramento law office address and case number appeared along the bottom. Priya said that public-facing information could identify former counsel through the docket without our opening the copied letter or using its private contents. The fact that the box sat in my garage did not give me the right to treat every page as mine. Evie found me at the kitchen table. After I closed the garage, I told her I had found a child's envelope that might be connected to Malcolm's earlier case, but I did not know who had written it and would not read it without permission. "He took my words," she said, looking at the 53 versions of Evie read. I told her being careful was not kindness to Malcolm. It was respect for another child. "That is harder," she said. She was right. The public docket identified Rebecca Holt, a lawyer who had represented the child's mother in part of the Sacramento paternity case. Priya would contact Rebecca rather than the mother or child directly. We would explain why the old case had appeared in the adoption file and make clear that they could ignore us. I wanted dates, missed visits, and every document that might expose Malcolm. Priya stopped me. "This family does not exist to strengthen your case." The correction stung because I had already treated adoption as the answer to Evie's wound. I could not turn another child's pain into the answer to mine. 2 days passed without a response. Malcolm sent 3 emails about the townhouse, and 1 about the joint declaration. His language remained polished. He referred to the courthouse incident as an unfortunate breakdown in communication. He said we should avoid escalating private family matters. He still did not ask about Evie. On Friday, Priya received a reply from Rebecca Holt. She no longer formally represented the mother, Dana Ellis, but had forwarded Priya's request with Dana's permission. Dana's first answer was no. She did not want Nathan involved in a dispute concerning Malcolm's wife, another child, or an adoption that had nothing to do with him. She would not permit anyone to contact her son. She would not allow his name, school, address, photographs, or private correspondence to become part of a public fight. I read her message in Priya's office. "She thinks I want Nathan to testify. She has spent years protecting him from promises Malcolm did not keep," Priya said. "Suspicion is reasonable. I do not want him in court. You know that now. She does not know you." Priya suggested we leave the decision with Dana. I asked whether I could write 1 letter. "Not an emotional appeal," she warned. "Do not ask her to save Evie. Do not tell her Nathan owes anyone the truth." I wrote the letter at the studio, after the last class ended. "Dana, you do not know me, and you do not owe me or my daughter anything. Malcolm's prior paternity and support case appeared in the investigation of his petition to adopt my 9-year-old daughter. He withdrew that petition at the final hearing and is now claiming I supplied incorrect information about his family history. I am not asking Nathan to speak to me, appear in court, or relive anything. I will not contact him. I only want the current record to reflect that I did not invent or conceal a child I was never told existed. You may decline. If you choose to provide anything, it can go through your lawyer with Nathan's information protected. Naomi Carter." I sent it to Priya, who removed 1 sentence that sounded as though Dana's documents could repair Evie's life. Then Rebecca forwarded the revised version. Dana agreed to 1 call 3 days later. Priya and Rebecca attended. Dana did not turn on her camera. Her voice was careful and flat at first. "Nathan is 16, she said. "He knows Malcolm is married. He does not know the details of your adoption." "I will keep it that way," I said. "You cannot promise what other adults will do." "No." I can promise I will not contact him or use his name publicly. Dana was silent. Then she asked what Malcolm had said at the hearing. I looked at Priya. She nodded. I repeated the sentence Malcolm had said to Evie. She's giving me a real child. I won't adopt someone else's. Dana inhaled once, sharply. He always needed the child to be the reason, she said. I did not ask what she meant. I waited. Dana explained that Malcolm's paternity had been legally established when Nathan was an infant. There had never been a genuine question about whether Nathan was his son after the judgment. Malcolm paid inconsistently during the years he worked for himself, creating arrears that remained active. Since joining the construction company in 2021, the current support had been withheld from his wages regularly. The amount still owed from the earlier years was $28,400. The number shocked me, but not as much as the years of withholding I had failed to identify. Because Malcolm's pay entered his personal account, and only a fixed household transfer reached our joint account, the deduction had appeared to me only once under the code GARN order. I had accepted his description of an old financial dispute because questioning him felt harder than insisting on the underlying order. Dana said Malcolm had seen Nathan a handful of times when he was young. He arrived with gifts, took photographs, promised regular weekends, and disappeared when routines replaced attention. Dana described the pattern without asking me to adopt her anger. Malcolm returned when he needed to look dependable, arrived with gifts, took photographs, and made plans that lasted only until routine demanded consistency. She refused to provide Nathan's school records, medical history, or private photographs. The only materials she would consider were documents that proved Malcolm knew Nathan existed and knew how to reach him. Listening to her, I kept picturing Evie finding the letters on my desk and turning another child's unanswered questions into a comparison with her own. I told Dana that Evie would not see the letters unless Nathan's side authorized it. Dana answered that even my daughter's need to understand did not outweigh Nathan's right to privacy. I wrote that sentence down because it corrected an instinct I still had. Pain did not grant access to someone else's pain. He liked the first visit, she said. The part where Nathan ran to him. He did not like the third or fourth visit when a child expected him to arrive on time. Nathan had written letters. Dana would not allow me to see originals, but she had retained copies. Through Rebecca, she agreed to provide 2 letters, a paternity judgment, a redacted arrears statement, wage withholding history, and a certified mail receipt signed by Malcolm. The first letter had been written when Nathan was 8. Dana read one sentence aloud. Did you forget my game again, or did you not want to come? I lowered my eyes. At 9, Evie had sat outside a courtroom polishing a badge because she believed Malcolm might be preparing a surprise. At 8, Nathan had waited at a field wondering whether the man who created him had forgotten. The second letter came 3 years later. Nathan no longer addressed Malcolm as Dad. He used his first name. Malcolm. Mom says I should stop waiting when you do not confirm. The language was simple. That made it worse. A child should not have needed a confirmation policy for his father. Dana had mailed at least one visitation notice and letter by certified mail. The receipt contained Malcolm's signature. He could not truthfully say he never knew how to find Nathan or had not received the communication. She also retained a text exchange in which Malcolm responded to a proposed weekend and then canceled the night before. The message established that he had Dana's number and knew the arrangements. It did not reveal Nathan's school or private medical information. I will provide only what proves what he knew, Dana said. Not everything he did. That is enough. No, she replied. It is what I am willing to provide. Whether it is enough for you is not my problem. She was right. I understand. Before ending the call, Dana gave me one condition. You do not tell your daughter Nathan's story as though it exists to teach her something. I will not. Nathan does not need to hate Malcolm. Forgive him, help you, or meet your child. He gets to have no role. I understand. This time she seemed to believe me. The documents arrived through counsel with Nathan's identifying information protected. The paternity judgment established Malcolm as his legal father. The arrears statement showed missed payments during Malcolm's self-employed years and regular wage withholding after 2021. A certified mail receipt carried Malcolm's familiar signature, and a text exchange showed that he knew Dana's number and had discussed a visit before canceling. Priya kept the proof narrow. The records established what Malcolm knew and what he did, not what he felt. I wanted the law to name the emptiness behind those actions. It could only record the actions themselves. That evening, Evie used my tablet to look for a photograph from her school exhibition. Malcolm's social media account remained visible because several family photographs were public. She found one of herself standing beside him beneath the banner "Families Build Our World." His caption said, "My girl, proud to be her dad." The post was dated 3 years earlier. I recognized the week because Evie had worn a cast on 2 fingers after falling from a scooter. Dana's certified mail receipt bore a date 4 days earlier. Nathan's letter had been delivered that same week. Evie looked from the screen to the document folder on the counter. Was that when the other kid wrote to him? I had not shown her Nathan's letters. She only knew that evidence confirmed Malcolm had another biological child and had received communication. A letter was delivered around that time. He posted me instead. We do not know what he did every day that week. He called me his girl where everyone could see. Yes. Did he use me to look like a good dad? The question contained anger, not self-pity. I sat beside her. I cannot tell you everything he intended. His actions show that he liked being seen as your father. They also show he did not consistently do the work of being Nathan's father. So I was easier. I think you were part of a life that made him look the way he wanted to look. Evie locked the tablet. Maybe he liked looking like my dad more than being one. I think that may be true. It hurt to say it, but I would not protect her with another softened answer. She slid off the chair and walked toward her room. Does Nathan hate me? I followed her to the hallway. He does not know you. But Malcolm put my picture up while he ignored him. That is Malcolm's responsibility, not yours. What if Nathan sees it? He is allowed to feel anything he feels. He does not have to forgive you, like you, meet you, or help us. You did not create the choice Malcolm made. Evie stood quietly. Can I feel sad for him without having to meet him? I told her yes. And that sympathy did not create an obligation. Nathan did not have to meet us, explain himself, forgive Malcolm, or help Evie feel less alone. Evie could care that he had been hurt without making him responsible for healing her. She seemed relieved by the distinction. For the first time, the existence of another abandoned child did not make her ask whether she had been replaced. It made her understand that Malcolm's choices belonged to Malcolm. Yes. She nodded and went into her room. The next morning, Dana's lawyer sent Malcolm formal notice that Dana had agreed to provide limited redacted records concerning his paternity judgment, support history, and communications. The notice also demanded that he not contact Nathan about our adoption dispute. That was how Malcolm learned we had reached Dana. He called me 6 times. I did not answer. Then an email arrived. Your harassment of my former family is unacceptable. If you continue contacting Dana or involve Nathan, I will seek a restraining order. I forwarded it to Priya. She replied through counsel that I had never contacted Dana or Nathan directly. Every communication had passed through attorneys. Dana had voluntarily chosen what to provide. No one had requested contact with Nathan. Malcolm sent another email, accusing me of turning 2 children against him. Priya advised me not to respond. His threat had lost some of its force because the paper trail showed exactly how contact occurred. Still, I checked the locks twice that night and asked Lorraine to remain available if Evie needed somewhere else to sleep. I did not tell Evie about the restraining order threat. It did not change her safety, or require a decision from her. For once, I did not place an adult conflict in her hands. 2 days later, Dana sent one final item. It was a screenshot of a text Malcolm had written years earlier after she asked him to attend a mediation about visitation. I do not want my name tied to a child I never chose. I read the sentence until the words blurred. At the courthouse, Malcolm had called Evie someone else's child. Years before, he had described his biological son as a child he never chose. Blood had never been his true condition. Convenience was. That night, after Evie went to sleep, my phone lit up with a message from Jocelyn. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the attached screenshot. The conversation was dated 2 weeks before the adoption hearing. Malcolm's message appeared beneath his name. I need Naomi emotional enough to sign before she starts reading. I read Malcolm's message until the words stopped looking like language. I need Naomi emotional enough to sign before she starts reading. The screenshot showed the date, the time, and several lines before it. Jocelyn had asked whether bringing her to the courthouse was necessary. Malcolm answered that my reaction would be useful. He said I would want to remove Evie from the hallway before the scene became worse. He expected me to take whatever paper he offered, sign it, and leave. Another message appeared beneath it. Do not argue with her. Just stand next to me. Let the pregnancy make the point. I sat alone at the kitchen table while the house settled around me. Evie was asleep upstairs. Her 53 practice signatures remained face down beneath a stack of mail. Malcolm had known she would be at the courthouse. He had known what the adoption meant to her. Her presence was not an accident he failed to consider. It was part of the pressure he intended to use against me. I called Priya even though it was nearly 10 at night. She answered after the second ring. Do not forward the screenshot to anyone else yet, she said after I explained. Send it to me. Then ask Jocelyn whether she is willing to preserve and export the complete conversation. What more do we need? He says exactly what he planned. A screenshot is useful for understanding. It is not the same as an authenticated record. We need the surrounding messages, account information, original device, and a declaration from her, if she chooses to provide one. I sent Priya the image. Then I opened Jocelyn's message again. Why are you giving me this? Her reply came several minutes later. Because I did not know he meant to use Evie that way. I typed, you knew she would be there. The dots appeared, disappeared, then returned. Yes. Why did you still go? This time she did not answer immediately. Malcolm said you already knew the marriage was over. He said the adoption was something you were forcing him to complete because you wanted to keep control of him. He told me Evie had already been prepared for the withdrawal. She had not been prepared for anything except becoming his daughter. I wrote that sentence, then deleted it. Jocelyn already knew what Evie had worn. She had seen the badge. She had watched a child pull it from her dress. Did he tell you what he planned to say? No. Did he tell you to hold the documents? Yes. Did he tell you I had agreed to sign? He said you would once you understood there was no future for the marriage. My hands tightened around the phone. You knew a 9-year-old would watch her father arrive with his pregnant mistress. I know. And you came anyway. Yes. There was no excuse in that answer. That was the first honest thing Jocelyn gave me. I called her the next morning, after Priya confirmed that Jocelyn had her own lawyer. Jocelyn first offered only the screenshot. She said exporting the whole thread felt like entering a war between Malcolm and me. Her attorney reminded her that preserving the complete conversation protected the truth of what she had said as much as what Malcolm had said, especially if he later disputed the account. By the end of the call, Jocelyn agreed to provide the relevant thread, retain the original device, and sign a declaration identifying the account. Priya joined openly and explained that the material would be limited to the court dispute and protected from public release. Before the call ended, I asked the question she had avoided the night before. Why did you stand there if you knew Evie would see you? Her voice dropped. I wanted him to choose me, where there could be no misunderstanding. And you needed a child to watch. I did not think about it that way. You knew she would be there. Yes, that means you thought about it. You just decided her pain mattered less than your certainty. Jocelyn did not argue. I am not asking you to forgive me, she said. I do not. The conversation ended without reconciliation. She was not my ally. She was a woman who had helped Malcolm hurt my child and had begun cooperating only after realizing his lies could threaten her own future. Her evidence still mattered. Her regret did not erase her choice. 2 days later, the authenticated export showed that Malcolm had chosen the timing, Jocelyn's entrance, and the moment he would hand me the declaration. He expected me to hurry Evie away before she heard more, and to sign in the hallway or immediately after the hearing. My refusal had not been part of his plan. Until then, I had thought his cruelty came from indifference. The messages proved he had selected the most painful setting because pain made me easier to control. That discovery changed my goal. Leaving Malcolm and protecting our home were no longer enough. If I signed, the permanent record could say that I had forced an unwilling man to adopt, supplied false family history, and used Evie's emotions to trap him. I would not let my daughter become the official reason for his concealment. The idea of releasing the screenshots publicly crossed my mind before I could stop it. Malcolm's company had ethics policies, and a single post could reach colleagues, studio parents, and everyone who had watched him call Evie his daughter. Priya cut off the possibility before it became a plan. She warned that public release could expose protected material, damage the case, and turn Evie's worst moment into permanent content for strangers. I imagined Malcolm reading the outrage, then imagined Evie's question copied into captions beneath his name. People would discuss her pain without knowing her. I closed the folder. No public release, I said. Protecting the record did not require turning my daughter into a public exhibit. I returned home with the exported messages and found Evie painting at the small table near the back window. She had covered a sheet of heavy paper with gray blocks, then painted a thin yellow line through the center. I sat across from her. I learned something about the courthouse. She kept painting. Did Malcolm lie again? Yes. I told her that Malcolm had prepared the papers before the hearing and had expected me to become too upset to read them carefully. I did not show her the full message thread. I did not repeat every detail about the pregnancy making the point, but I said more than I should have. I told Miss Shaw what you asked me in the hallway, I said. She understands why I wanted to get you away from there. Evie's brush stopped. You told her my words? Yes. Did you ask me? No. The answer sounded worse when spoken aloud. I needed to explain what happened. You could explain what he did. I should have asked before repeating what you said. You keep doing that. What? Using what I feel to explain what adults do. I sat back. I was not trying to use you. You told the lawyer because it made the papers sound worse. That was not why. Then why did you tell her the exact words? I had no answer that did not defend myself. Evie placed the brush in the water jar. Do not let anyone use that sentence. I will not. You already did. You are right. She looked at me for several seconds. I need to talk to Miss Shaw about the case, but I do not have to repeat your words. I can tell her you do not consent to that sentence being used. What if it makes it harder? Then it becomes harder. What if Malcolm wins? This is not your job to win. She looked down at the yellow line in her painting. Do not put it online. I will not. Do not tell Grandma. I have not. Do not tell the school. I will not. And if a judge wants me to say it, you will get to decide what you are willing to say. We will ask what the law requires, but no one will turn your pain into a performance. She picked up the brush again, but she did not continue painting. I do not believe promises today. I understand. I called Priya from the studio hallway and told her Evie did not consent to the question being quoted in any filing or declaration. We do not need it, Priya said. The adult documents are stronger than a child's reaction. That should have relieved me. Instead, I felt ashamed that part of me had feared losing useful evidence. 3 days later, Malcolm filed his declaration supporting the request to withdraw. His account described the adoption as a process I had driven for months despite his uncertainty. He claimed I repeatedly used Evie's fear of abandonment to pressure him. He said I had coached Evie to make emotional statements at the courthouse and had created a public scene to damage his relationship with Jocelyn. Attached to his declaration were selected screenshots from our text history. "When are you going to finish the forms? You promised Evie this would be done before summer. She cannot survive another disappointment from a father. Please stop delaying and tell me whether you intend to keep your word." The messages were real. Placed alone, they made me look relentless. Malcolm had removed his replies. He did not include the nights he said he wanted the adoption, but needed one more week. He excluded the messages where he asked me to tell Evie everything was progressing. He omitted the photograph he sent of a signed page with the words, "Almost official." Priya spread the incomplete chain across her desk. "This is why we preserve everything," she said. "He is making me look like I forced him. He is showing that you applied pressure." I did. Yes. The word landed without judgment. You reminded him. You argued. You used Evie's disappointment to urge him to act. We will not pretend otherwise. Does that make his declaration true? No. Pressure does not explain why he voluntarily attended a private interview, strengthened his declarations, concealed a paternity judgment, and prepared a plan to make you sign before reading. She requested the full conversation rather than selected excerpts. That meant every uncomfortable message would become part of our response. There were moments when I accused Malcolm of failing Evie. There were nights when I said a real father would stop postponing. Once, after he delayed another appointment, I wrote that if he backed out, Evie would know he had never loved her enough. I had believed I was forcing him to face the harm he caused. Now I could see that I had placed Evie's worth in the argument. I had used her fear to demand a promise from a man whose actions already answered me. "Will Evie see these?" I asked. "They may become part of a protected court record. We can ask to limit access and redact unnecessary details. But Malcolm may use them when speaking to her if he gains contact. He is not seeing her. That boundary can be requested. Do not assume it exists without an order or agreement." Through counsel, Malcolm offered to continue his mortgage contribution, pay temporary household expenses, and cover part of the adoption-related fees if I signed a joint declaration saying the process had primarily been my initiative and that I had supplied the family history. The terms would help. My studio had lost the city mural project, summer enrollment had fallen, and legal fees were consuming my savings. Priya warned that signing might shorten the dispute, but would not guarantee Malcolm stopped accusing me. I refused. Priya did not praise me. Then we prepare for the cost. I sold 2 pottery wheels, a commercial paper cutter, and portable display panels. I moved an adult class online, combined 2 after-school groups, and called parents to explain schedule changes without exposing Evie's private life. The doors stayed open, but every empty space in the studio showed what refusing Malcolm's version cost. Evie watched a buyer load 1 pottery wheel into a van. "Are we closing?" "No." "Are you selling things because of the lawyer?" "Partly." "Would you keep them if you signed Malcolm's paper?" I did not soften the answer. "Maybe." She looked toward the empty space where the wheel had stood. "Would signing make everything go away?" "It might make some court arguments end sooner." "And then it is over?" "No, the paper would stay. It would say I agreed that the adoption happened because I pushed Malcolm and gave the wrong information." "Would it say I made him do it?" "Not exactly, but that is what people would think." "Yes." Evie folded her arms. "Then do not sign it." "I am not going to." She looked at me sharply. "You said you would not promise. This is my decision. I can tell you what I have decided. What if we lose the house? We will deal with where we live if that happens." What if the studio closes? I will do everything I can to keep it open, but I will not make you responsible for that either. She stared at the empty space again. I hate that saying no costs us things. So do I. At home that night, Priya called to discuss whether Evie should meet with a child specialist connected to the court process. The purpose would not be to prove Malcolm was cruel. It would be to document Evie's wishes and protect her from being pulled into adult accusations. I took the call in the kitchen. Evie entered while Priya was explaining that no direct appearance might be necessary if the adult documents were sufficient. Would she have to describe the hallway? I asked. Only if she chooses, and if it becomes necessary. We can build the record without making her retell everything. Evie stood in the doorway. Are you talking about me? I ended the speaker function. Miss Shaw was explaining options. Do I have to talk to someone? No decision has been made. Do you want me to? I hesitated. That hesitation answered her. Evie came closer. Will it help your case? It might help the court understand what you want. You already know what I want. Yes. I do not want to talk about the badge. I do not want to say what I asked you. I do not want adults looking at me like I am the sad little girl in their case. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. I am not meeting anyone to tell that story. I am not meeting anyone to tell that story. Evie stood in the kitchen doorway with both hands clenched at her sides. Priya was still on my phone, quiet enough that I could hear only the faint sound of papers moving in her office. I told Priya I would call her back. After I ended the call, Evie looked at the empty space where the second pottery wheel had stood before I sold it. Are you mad at me? No. You stopped talking when I said no. I stopped because I needed to listen. Will it hurt your case if I do not talk? The truthful answer was not simple. Her reaction at the courthouse helped show the human cost of Malcolm's actions. A specialist could document that Evie did not want contact with him, and that she understood what had happened. Part of me still wanted every possible piece of support because Malcolm had already begun rewriting the day. Evie saw my hesitation. You are disappointed. I am worried about what Malcolm is saying. That is different from being disappointed in you. Would talking make it easier? It might give the court more information. So you do want me to. I pulled out a chair and sat, so I was not standing above her. I want the truth protected. I do not want you harmed again to protect it. That is not an answer. She was right. I thought your words might help, I said. When you said you did not want to speak, a part of me worried about losing that help. Evie's face tightened. But you do not owe me help, I continued. You do not owe a lawyer, a judge, or anyone else a performance of what happened to you. You already told Miss Shaw what I said. Yes. So now you are saying it because I got angry. No. I am saying it because you showed me I was wrong. She looked away. The silence stretched between us. I wanted to fill it with reassurance. I wanted to tell her we would fix everything and that the court would understand without her. I had spent years smoothing uncertainty into promises because I could not bear to watch fear settle on her face. This time, I stayed quiet. Evie walked to the table and touched the edge of the face-down sheet where she had practiced Malcolm's last name. You told everybody about the adoption. Not everybody. You told Grandma. Yes. You told Mrs. Tan. Yes. You told the parents at the studio. I told some of them we would be celebrating. You put the date on the calendar. Yes. You ordered a cake. The lemon cake was still in the bakery freezer. I had called the morning after the hearing and asked them not to deliver it. Yes. You let Mrs. Tan make the new name card. It was only a draft. You let her make it. Yes. Evie turned over the sheet of signatures. The page was creased near the bottom where she had pressed too hard with the marker. 53 versions of Evie Reed filled nearly every inch. Then she looked at me. You let me practice his name. There was no accusation louder than that sentence. I could have told her Malcolm had encouraged the adoption. I could have shown her his signed forms, his edited declarations, and the message where he told me everything was set. All of those facts mattered, but none of them excused what I had done. I did. You knew he kept putting it off. Yes. You knew he did not come home. Yes. You knew he got mad when you asked about papers. Yes. Then why did you say it was definitely happening? I folded my hands in my lap, because I did not trust them to remain still. I was afraid to tell you that I was uncertain. Why? Because your first father left. I knew how much you wanted Malcolm to choose you. I thought if I kept believing his promises, he would eventually become the man he said he was. That does not make sense. No, it does not. You thought bringing me to court would make him do it. I felt my face heat. I hoped seeing how much it meant to you would make him keep his word. You used me too. The sentence landed with the full weight of the truth inside it. Not in the same way Malcolm had. I had not planned to humiliate her or transfer blame. I had wanted to give her safety, but I had still allowed her presence, her hope, and her fear of abandonment to become pressure on a decision an adult should have made honestly. I did not mean to, I said. That is what everyone says when they do something bad. I closed my eyes for 1 second. You are right. Evie's anger finally broke through the calm she had carried since court. If you told me he might say no, it would have hurt. But it would not have hurt like that. Her voice rose. I would not have worn the badge. I would not have written his name 53 times. I would not have asked Mrs. Tan to make the card. I would not have stood there looking stupid while he brought her. You did not look stupid. I felt stupid. I reached toward her, then stopped before touching her. I am sorry. She wiped her face with the heel of her uninjured hand. I do not want to hear that you did it because you love me. I will not say that, because love does not make it okay. No. She carried the practice sheet to her room and shut the door. For the next 2 days, Evie spoke to me only when necessary. She answered questions about meals, school, and homework. She did not sit beside me while I prepared studio supplies. She stopped bringing her sketchbook into the kitchen. I respected the distance until Thursday night, when she appeared at the top of the stairs with a small overnight bag. I want to stay with Grandma Lorraine tomorrow. For the weekend? One night. Did you ask her? No, you can ask. I wanted to say we should stay together because things were difficult. I wanted to insist we could repair the distance only by being in the same house. Instead, I called my mother. Lorraine did not ask what Evie and I had argued about. She said she would collect her after school and bring her home Saturday afternoon. Her only question was whether Evie needed medication or anything special packed. The next morning, I placed clean clothes, her toothbrush, and the stuffed rabbit she pretended she no longer slept with into the overnight bag. When Lorraine arrived at school pickup, Evie hugged her before getting into the car. She looked at me through the window, but did not wave. That night, the townhouse felt larger than it had when Malcolm stopped coming home. I sat at the kitchen table with a blank page. The first version of my letter began with explanations. I wanted you to have the family I thought you deserved. I crossed it out. The second began with my intentions. I never meant to place you in the middle. I crossed that out too. Intentions had protected adults throughout Evie's life. Her biological father never meant to disappear permanently. Malcolm never meant for the process to become so emotional. Jocelyn never thought about what her presence would do. I started again. Evie, you were right. I saw Malcolm delay, avoid questions, and become angry when I asked for certainty. I was afraid the truth would hurt you, so I treated hope like a fact. I let you prepare for a future I could not guarantee. I also hoped that seeing your trust would make Malcolm keep his promise. That put you inside an adult decision where you never should have been. You do not owe me forgiveness because I have admitted this. You do not have to make me feel like a good mother. I will not use your words, your fear, or your pain to force anyone to stay. I will be here when you are ready to tell me what you need. Mom. I left the letter on her desk before Lorraine brought her home. Evie read it alone. She came downstairs 20 minutes later, carrying the page folded in half. I have rules, she said. All right, she sat across from me. No one posts anything I say. Agreed. No pictures of the badge. Agreed. No one records me without asking first. Agreed. I do not have to see Malcolm. I will ask Priya to protect that boundary and explain what we can legally do. Evie frowned. That was not yes. I will not arrange contact with him. If a court ever requires something different, I will tell you before anything happens. I will fight for your choice, but I will not promise what a judge will do. She considered that. Okay, if I write something, I choose the words. Yes. And I can change my mind after I write it. Yes. Even if the lawyer already likes it. Yes. Even if it helps. Yes. She unfolded my letter and placed it between us. You cannot tell people I forgave you. I will not. I have not. I know. Her shoulders lowered slightly. The next week, Priya met with us at the studio, rather than asking Evie to come to a law office. She sat at one of the child-sized art tables while Evie chose the chair nearest the door. Priya explained that the adult documents already showed Malcolm had signed the adoption petition, edited his declarations, concealed the prior paternity matter, and prepared the joint declaration before the hearing. You do not have to appear in court for those papers to exist, Priya said. Evie looked at me. Mom thought I was important evidence. Priya did not rescue me from the statement. Your experience matters, she said. That does not mean you have to describe it for adults. What if I want the judge to know? I do not want Malcolm to talk to me. We can communicate your wishes in a limited way. You may write something, or we can ask for another protected method. You can also decide not to provide anything. Will you use what I asked Mom at court? No. Your mother told me you do not consent to that sentence being used. I do not need it. Evie took a blank sheet from the stack beside her. She wrote for several minutes, then tore the page in half. Her second attempt lasted longer. She read it silently and tore that one too. On the third page, she wrote until the words covered nearly half the sheet. Then she crossed out every line. I cannot make it sound right. It does not have to sound impressive, Priya said. If it is not sad enough, adults will not care. The room went still. Who told you that? I asked. No one. It is how people listen. She pointed toward the courthouse. They care because I cried and the pin made me bleed. They do not care that he kept saying he would do it before that. Priya leaned forward slightly. You do not need to make your story more painful for me to take it seriously. What if the judge does? The strongest part of the case is what Malcolm wrote and signed. Your statement is about what you want, not proving what kind of man he is. Evie looked at the blank paper again. Can it be short? Yes. Can I leave out the badge? Yes. Can I leave out what I asked Mom? Yes. Can I say he called me his daughter before? Yes, if that is what you want to say. Evie wrote slowly. When she finished, she turned the page toward us. Malcolm called me his daughter when it made him feel like my dad. At court, he called me someone else's child, because a new baby was coming. I do not want to meet him or talk about the hearing. I want to say what my own words mean. Priya read it once. This is clear. Do you like it? What matters is whether it says what you want. Evie looked at me. I did not praise the writing, or tell her how powerful it was. Does it say what you want? I asked. For now. Priya placed the page inside a plain folder. It will not be filed until you and your mother review how it would be protected. You can change your mind before then. Evie nodded. She did not include the sentence she had whispered in the courthouse hallway. That sentence remained hers. Priya built our response around the adult records. Malcolm's petition. his private interview notes, the joint declaration, his editing history, the exported messages from Jocelyn, the paternity judgment and limited records Dana had provided. Evie's statement was not the center. For the first time since the courthouse, I understood that protecting her voice sometimes meant allowing the case to become harder. I also arranged family therapy with a licensed counselor named Dr. Lena Ortiz. Our first session did not reveal a hidden solution. Dr. Ortiz did not tell Evie to forgive me or explain Malcolm's behavior with a convenient diagnosis. She asked Evie what safety looked like now. "Knowing before everyone else knows," Evie said. She asked me what I did when I was afraid of disappointing my daughter. "I make certainty where there is none." Dr. Ortiz asked what I could do instead. "Say I do not know." Evie looked at me. "And not make the answer prettier," she added. At home after the session, Evie opened the drawer where she had placed the Daddy's Girl badge. She carried it to the kitchen and set it on a cloth. The pin on the back was bent. She used a pair of small jewelry pliers from the studio to remove it completely. "Are you throwing it away?" I asked. "No." She separated the sharp metal from the painted cardstock face. "I do not want it to hurt me again." She placed the words "Daddy's Girl" back inside the drawer and threw only the damaged pin into the trash. "What will you do with the rest?" "I do not know yet." I did not offer an answer. The following afternoon, Priya called while I was preparing paint trays for class. Malcolm had filed another declaration. This one asked the adoption record to state that I had coached Evie, manipulated her fear of abandonment, and pressured him to continue a petition he no longer wanted. He wanted the court to accept that Evie's pain had not resulted from his plan. He wanted the record to say it had been created by me. Malcolm wanted the adoption record to say I had created Evie's pain. Priya read his new declaration without changing expression. When she finished, she placed it beside the adoption petition and the joint declaration. "He is no longer defending one version," she said. "He is trying to keep 3 versions separated." She opened a spreadsheet on her laptop. The first column contained dates. The second listed what Malcolm had signed or said. The third identified who was present. The fourth showed the evidence source. Priya did not title it betrayal, abandonment, or cruelty. She called it the Reed chronology. The first document was the adoption petition. In it, Malcolm described Evie as his daughter in every meaningful sense. He said he wanted to make their bond permanent and accepted lifelong responsibility. The second record came from the paternity and support case involving Nathan. In that history, Malcolm had resisted responsibility for a biological son and later described him as a child he had never chosen. The third document was the joint declaration. In that version, Malcolm claimed he had never truly wanted to adopt Evie and had participated only because I pressured him. 3 documents, 3 versions of fatherhood, 1 man responsible for every signature. Priya asked me to read the documents aloud in date order. I began with the adoption petition. "I have functioned as Evie Carter's father for 6 years and wish to assume all permanent legal responsibilities of parenthood." My voice faltered on permanent. Priya waited. I continued with Malcolm's old message concerning Nathan. "I do not want my name tied to a child I never chose." Then I read the joint declaration. The adoption process was initiated and maintained primarily through the insistence of Naomi Carter despite my repeated uncertainty. The words changed, depending on which child he wanted to reject and which woman he wanted to blame. Priya added another row to the chronology. "The court has authorized limited use of the investigator's relevant interview notes," she said. "Not the entire confidential report." Marta Bell had interviewed Malcolm alone during the adoption investigation. I had not been in the room. No one could claim I whispered answers or corrected him. In the permitted summary, Malcolm described bedtime routines, school pickups, art projects, and the way Evie called for him when she had nightmares. He told Marta that being her father had taught him patience. He said adoption would recognize a commitment he had already made. Marta had asked whether anyone was pressuring him. He answered no. She asked whether he understood he could stop the process before the final order if he was uncertain. He said he was certain. I stared at that word. Why did we not have this earlier? I asked. The investigator's notes are confidential, Priya said. The court released only the portions necessary to address his claim that you supplied every answer and forced his participation. He lied when no one else was in the room. He made statements inconsistent with what he says now. You always make it sound smaller. I make it sound provable. That was why Malcolm feared her. Priya did not need to call him a liar when his own timeline could do it. Dana's documents formed the next section of the chronology. Her lawyer provided the paternity judgment, the redacted arrears statement, wage withholding history, certified mail receipt, and limited correspondence under a protective arrangement. Nathan's name appeared only where necessary. His address, school, medical information, and personal details remained hidden. He did not become public property because Malcolm had concealed him. Dana also sent a one-sentence statement Nathan had approved. My father knew how to contact me, but did not maintain contact. There was no description of missed birthdays, no plea for sympathy, no demand that Malcolm apologize. Nathan gave the record one fact and kept the rest of his life. Will he have to testify? I asked. No. Can Malcolm force him? Not through what we are requesting. Dana's attorney will oppose any attempt to drag him into this adoption matter. The documents already establish the objective facts we need. I thought of Nathan deciding exactly one sentence was enough. At 16, he had learned a boundary I was only beginning to teach Evie. Jocelyn's exported messages added another version. Malcolm told her I had forced the adoption. He said the process existed because I needed control and could not accept the marriage was ending. In a separate exchange, Jocelyn asked whether he had any biological children or unresolved support issues before they planned a future together. Malcolm answered no. Not complicated, not private, no. Jocelyn had preserved the message on her phone and included it in her authenticated export. When Priya showed it to me, I felt no satisfaction. Jocelyn pressed both palms against the table. He told me this pregnancy was the first time he had a child of his own. Her stomach was more pronounced now. The baby shifted beneath her blouse while she stared at Malcolm's message. She had come to Priya's office with her own attorney. She was not there as my friend or as a witness seeking redemption. She wanted to understand how Malcolm's hidden son and support arrears might affect the child she was carrying. Her lawyer had already explained that private promises made before birth could not erase the future child's rights. Jocelyn would need to address pregnancy expenses, legal parentage after birth, support, and any parenting arrangement through proper procedures. Malcolm had promised he would take care of everything. Jocelyn no longer believed a promise was a plan. He said we did not need lawyers, she said. He said involving courts would make us hostile before the baby was even born. Priya did not comment. Jocelyn's attorney asked whether Malcolm had provided complete financial disclosures. No, Jocelyn said. Has he signed an acknowledgement of responsibility for pregnancy expenses? He said he would. That was not my question. Jocelyn looked at me then. I recognized the expression. It was the moment a woman realized she had mistaken reassurance for security. She left Priya's office without asking me to forgive her. That afternoon, Malcolm called her. I did not hear the conversation, but Jocelyn later provided the messages that followed. Malcolm accused her of letting me manipulate her. He said I was using Nathan's mother, Evie, and now Jocelyn to construct a false pattern. Jocelyn answered that paternity judgments and wage withholding were not interpretations. Malcolm wrote that she was becoming emotional and needed to stop listening to women who hated him. She replied that she had retained counsel. His next message contained only 4 words. Naomi put you up to this. Jocelyn did not answer. She did not join my side. She stopped helping Malcolm maintain his. At our next meeting, Malcolm appeared by video with his attorney. The purpose was not a trial. It was a conference concerning the pending withdrawal, the disputed record, and the documents each side expected to submit. Malcolm wore a white shirt and dark tie. The room behind him looked like a corporate conference space. He spoke calmly. "The documents reflect different periods of my life," Priya asked him to clarify. "My feelings and circumstances changed." "Did your biological relationship to Nathan change?" "No." "Did the support order begin after the adoption petition?" "No." "Did the arrears disappear before you answered that you had no other children or obligations?" "My attorney advised me that an old matter did not affect my ability to adopt." His lawyer shifted slightly. Priya looked down at the questionnaire. "The form did not ask whether another child affected your ability to adopt. It asked whether another child or support obligation existed." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I understood the question differently. You edited the answer from a blank field to none. I completed many forms during a stressful period. You also wrote to Jocelyn that you had never had a biological child. That was a private conversation. Was the statement accurate? It reflected the fact that I had never had a meaningful paternal relationship." Priya did not raise her voice. "The question was whether you had a biological child." Malcolm leaned back. "You are reducing complex family history to technical language. The adoption petition is technical language." He looked toward the camera as though searching for me among the small windows on the screen. "This is what Naomi does. She takes emotional situations and turns them into tests no one can pass." I almost responded. Priya spoke first. "We are not asking whether Mr. Reed felt like a father. We are asking whether he knew a paternity judgment, a support order, current withholding, and arrears existed when he declared that none existed." Malcolm's attorney requested a break. The screen went blank. I released the breath I had been holding. "He will say every document belongs to a different emotional truth," I said. "Emotional truth does not change the existence of a court order," Priya replied. When the conference resumed, Malcolm's attorney offered to correct the adoption record without admitting deliberate concealment. The file could state that Malcolm withdrew his consent and that incomplete information had been supplied through misunderstanding. Priya asked whose misunderstanding. The attorney said both parties had participated in preparing the forms. I felt the familiar temptation to accept a softer sentence if it ended the conflict. Incomplete information had been supplied. No name, no responsibility, no acknowledgement that Malcolm had known the truth. Priya looked at me before answering. I shook my head. "We will not agree to shared responsibility for information solely within Mr. Reed's knowledge," she said. Afterward, Priya told me our own message history had to be added to the chronology. Not only the messages that helped us, all of them. We sat at my dining table while my phone backup downloaded onto an encrypted drive. Priya searched by dates and terms connected to the adoption. Hundreds of messages appeared. Some made Malcolm look exactly as I remembered him. "I want this too. I am just overwhelmed. Tell Evie I am not backing out. I will finish the forms this weekend." Almost official. Other messages made me look harder than I wanted to see. "You cannot keep doing this to her. A real father does not make a child beg for certainty. If you walk away now, she will know she was never enough for you." Priya highlighted that last message. "I hate that sentence," I said. "Why?" "Because I made his decision a measurement of Evie." "Yes. I was trying to make him understand." "You were applying pressure. Are you saying he was right?" "I am saying part of what he alleges is supported. You pushed him. That does not prove you fabricated his paternity history or forced him to sign false declarations." I read another message. "Do not make me bring Evie into this conversation," Malcolm had replied. Maybe seeing her disappointment is what I need. I had forgotten that exchange. At the time, I interpreted it as guilt. I believed he wanted to confront the emotional consequences of another delay. Now it looked different. He had learned that Evie's presence could make me act. Priya copied the full thread, including the messages that hurt me. You could submit only the most favorable parts, she said. He would accuse you of hiding context, and he would be right. Will every word become public? We will request sealing and redactions where appropriate. The court still needs enough context to understand the dispute. I looked toward the stairs. Evie cannot read these. We cannot build strategy around controlling every fact she may eventually learn. She will think I used her. Did you? The question was not cruel. That made it impossible to dismiss. I used her disappointment in arguments with Malcolm. Then the safest path is not pretending otherwise. I wanted to wait until after the hearing to face that truth. I wanted the court to decide Malcolm was responsible before I admitted how often I had tried to force him into fatherhood with Evie's pain. Priya closed the message file. The evidence is strongest when it remains complete. Malcolm's pattern is not one cruel statement. It is repeated commitment when fatherhood benefits him, followed by withdrawal when responsibility becomes inconvenient. The 3 documents now formed a clear structure. In the adoption petition, Malcolm wanted the identity of father. In Nathan's record, he rejected obligation to a biological child. In the joint declaration, he denied ever wanting responsibility for Evie and assigned the process to me. He could explain each paper separately. Placed together, they exposed the method. He did not simply change his mind. He changed the story depending on who needed to carry the blame. That evening, Evie found me placing the redacted Nathan records into a locked cabinet. "Is that about him?" she asked. "About Nathan, yes. Can I read it?" "You could ask, but I do not think it would help you. Most of it concerns private things that belong to him." "Did he write something?" "One sentence." "What did it say?" I hesitated. Evie noticed. "Am I allowed to know?" He allowed the adults handling the case to use it. He did not say it could be shared everywhere. "Then do not tell me." She walked toward the kitchen, then stopped. "Does he have to come to court?" "No." "Did he get to choose?" "Yes." "Even if it would help?" "Yes." Evie absorbed the answer. "So when he says no, everyone has to listen." "We should." "And he does not have to explain more?" "No." She looked toward the folder containing her own statement. "Then I do not either." "You do not." For the first time since she wrote it, she seemed less afraid that her one-page statement would become the beginning of endless questions. Nathan's refusal had given her something no adult explanation had. Proof that a boundary could survive pressure. Priya prepared a narrow request for the continued hearing. She asked the court to accept Malcolm's unilateral withdrawal and close the adoption without pretending it was mutual. She asked the court to reject the unsigned joint declaration as a shared account. She requested that any statement from Evie remain protected and be used only with her permission. She also asked the court to record that the proceeding did not end because Evie misbehaved or because I had supplied Malcolm's undisclosed paternity history. The discrepancies concerning the support order and prior declarations could be referred to the appropriate court or agency for independent review. No instant arrest. No demand that Judge Stone decide Malcolm's entire life. Only an accurate record. When Priya finished the draft, she turned the laptop toward me. "This will not make him lose everything." "I know. It may not produce the public humiliation you could create by releasing Jocelyn's messages. I do not want Evie's worst day made public. It will not force him to become honest in every relationship. No. It asks the court to refuse one specific lie." I read the requested language again. The adoption concluded because Malcolm Adrian Reed withdrew his consent. Not because Evie was unworthy. Not because I invented his past. Not because a child's need for belonging had forced a man to become a father. I approved the filing. Malcolm received notice the following morning. At 4:13 that afternoon, he sent me a private message. "You should think carefully before submitting your complete texts. Evie will see that you suspected me long before the hearing and still brought her there." Malcolm's message remained on my screen long after the light faded from the kitchen windows. You should think carefully before submitting your complete texts. Evie will see that you suspected me long before the hearing and still brought her there. He intended it as a threat. That did not make it false. I opened the message archive Priya had prepared and returned to the earliest months of the adoption process. At first, the conversations looked ordinary. I sent reminders about forms. Malcolm blamed work deadlines, crowded court calendars, and slow background checks. He ended most exchanges with some version of the same reassurance. I want this too. Keep telling Evie it is happening. We are almost there. Then I found a message from January. Why are you delaying the investigator interview again? Malcolm had answered 20 minutes later. I do not want some stranger digging through every mistake I made before I met you. I remembered reading those words while standing in the studio supply closet. I had asked what mistake he meant. An old dispute. Nothing that affects us. I replied that every adult had a past, and that the investigator was not there to punish him. I never asked whether the dispute involved a child. Another exchange came from March, after Marta requested more information about Malcolm's previous addresses. Why does she need every place I lived in Sacramento? Because she is verifying the history you gave her. This is exactly what I did not want. People like her keep digging until they create problems that were already over. I answered with a heart and told him we would get through it together. At the time, I thought he was ashamed of debt, a failed business, or some private legal disagreement. Those explanations had not come from Malcolm. I created them because they allowed me to keep moving toward the adoption. I found another message, sent after he canceled a meeting with Marta. You cannot keep avoiding this. Evie already believes the hearing will happen before summer. His answer came quickly. Then stop discussing dates with her. I wrote back that he had been the one who promised. He replied that I was making a procedural delay emotional. I had forgotten that sentence. I had not forgotten the argument, but I had changed its meaning in my memory. I told myself Malcolm feared paperwork. The messages showed something else. He feared examination. I scrolled through the thread until I found the night I pushed hardest. If there is something in your past that could stop the adoption, tell me now. Nothing will stop it. Then why are you afraid of the investigation? Because I know how these systems work. One irrelevant issue becomes 10 questions, and suddenly, strangers decide what kind of man I am. I accepted that answer. The next morning, I told Evie the delay was only scheduling. The shame rose slowly because no single message proved I knew about Nathan. I had not known. Malcolm had hidden the paternity judgment, the support order, and 16 years of history. But I had known he was afraid of someone looking too closely. I had known his explanations did not fit. I had chosen the version that protected the future I wanted. My phone rang. Malcolm's name appeared. I did not answer. A second message arrived. If you submit everything, I will explain that you used Evie's abandonment issues to keep our marriage together. I forwarded both messages to Priya. She called within minutes. He is trying to frighten you away from a complete record, she said. Is he wrong? That depends on which part you mean. Did I use Evie to pressure him? Priya paused. You repeatedly reminded him of her fear and disappointment. You hoped those emotions would make him complete the adoption. A court may find that uncomfortable. I find it uncomfortable. That is not the same as causing his concealment or planning the courthouse scene. But it gives him something real. Yes. The answer left no place to hide. Priya explained our options. We could submit only the messages directly connected to Malcolm's false declarations and courthouse plan. That would make our account cleaner. But he possessed the full thread. If he produced the omitted messages, he could accuse me of shaping the evidence to protect myself. The other option was to submit the entire relevant chain, with a declaration acknowledging my conduct. If we do that, his lawyer will question you about every message where you pushed him, Priya said. I know. He may argue that the adoption petition continued, Because you refused to accept his uncertainty. He kept telling me he wanted it. The complete change shows that too. Will it show that I suspected something? Yes. I looked through the glass doors of the studio. Evie was in the main room helping a younger student wash paint from a tray. She bent close to explain how to keep blue water from splashing onto the floor. She had asked me to tell the truth, even when it made me look bad. I had treated that promise as something I could keep later, after I secured the outcome. There would always be another reason to wait. Submit everything, I said. Priya did not congratulate me. We will review the declaration together before filing. I need to tell Evie first. Yes. I do not want Malcolm to tell her. Then speak before he can use the Malcolm. Information as a weapon. That evening, I made dinner and barely touched it. Evie ate half her rice, then carried her plate to the sink. Can we talk? She turned without sitting. Is this about court? It is about what I knew before we went. Her face became still. I moved the papers from the table but left the chairs where they were. Evie chose the one farthest from me. I read all my old messages with Malcolm, I began. I need to tell you something I should have admitted sooner. Did you know about Nathan? No. I did not know Malcolm had a son. Did you know there was another kid? No. She watched me closely. I knew Malcolm was afraid of the adoption investigator looking into his past. He said there was an old dispute and that it did not matter. I asked questions, but when his answers stayed unclear, I stopped asking. Why? Because I wanted the adoption to happen. Evie looked toward the refrigerator where her practice signatures had once hung. I told myself he was embarrassed about money or some old mistake. I believed the explanation that made it easiest to continue. Did you think he might be lying? Yes. The word changed the room. Evie's eyes filled, but she did not look away. You knew he might be lying, and still said the hearing was certain. Yes. Why did you take me? I forced myself not to answer with love. I wanted the family I had imagined. I wanted you to have the same last name as Malcolm, and to believe no one could leave again. I also hoped that if he saw you there, dressed for the hearing and trusting him, he would keep his promise. Evie pushed her chair back. You brought me to make him say yes. I hoped your presence would make it harder for him to say no. That is the same thing. Yes. She stood. You put me in the middle. I did. You let me wear that badge because you thought he would feel guilty. I did not think of it that directly at the time. But that is what you did. Yes. Her breath came faster. You and Malcolm both wanted me there for something. The comparison hurt because it was not equal, but correcting the scale would have protected me instead of listening to her. He planned to use your pain to make me sign, I said. I hoped your trust would make him keep his promise. Those actions were not the same, but both placed you inside an adult decision. I was wrong. Evie walked to the bottom of the stairs. You already knew this when you wrote the apology letter. I knew part of it. I had not faced how much I suspected before the hearing. So every time you say the truth, there is another truth later. I had no defense. That is how it feels, I said. That is how it is. She went upstairs and closed her door. I remained at the table until the food turned cold. I did not follow her. I did not ask her to understand that I had also been deceived. She already knew Malcolm lied. What she needed was space to understand that her mother had seen danger and brought her forward anyway. The next morning, Evie asked Lorraine to drive her to school. I agreed. For 4 days, she kept her distance. She spoke during therapy but rarely at home. Dr. Ortiz asked whether Evie wanted me in the room for the whole session. No, she said. I waited outside for 20 minutes. When I returned, Evie had written one sentence on a card. I need to know you will never use me to make a man stay. Dr. Ortiz placed the card on the table between us. I read it twice. I will not, I said. Evie's expression hardened. You cannot just say that. She was right again. A promise without a change in behavior was what had brought us there. I will not ask you to convince anyone to love us, I said. I will not tell a man that your pain should make him stay. I will not put you in a room so your face can pressure someone into choosing us. What if you are scared they will leave? Then I will deal with that fear as an adult. I will not make it your job. What if you think it is best for me? I will tell you what I know and what I do not know. I will not turn hope into certainty. Evie folded the card once. I need time. You can have it. She did not forgive me that day. The declaration took 3 meetings to complete. Priya began with the facts that helped us. Malcolm had completed and edited the adoption forms. He had privately told Marta he wanted to become Evie's legal father. He concealed the paternity case and support obligation. He prepared the joint declaration before continuing to assure us that the hearing would proceed. He planned to make me emotional enough to sign without reading. Then we wrote the facts that hurt. I had pressed Malcolm to complete the adoption. I repeatedly invoked Evie's disappointment. I knew he feared deeper examination of his past. I accepted vague answers because I wanted the adoption to continue. I brought Evie to the final hearing, hoping her presence would make Malcolm follow through. I read the final paragraph aloud. I acknowledged that I promised my daughter an outcome I could not guarantee, and used her expected disappointment in private arguments with Malcolm Reed. I did not know he had a legally recognized biological child or a support obligation. I did not prepare his answers about prior children, and I did not authorize the statements contained in the proposed joint declaration. My voice shook. Priya waited until I finished. This will be difficult under questioning, she said. It should be. It is not punishment. I know. The complete message chain was attached with limited redactions unrelated to the case. We did not remove the sentences that made me ashamed. Malcolm's attorney responded within 2 days. He argued that my declaration proved I had manipulated the adoption from the beginning. Malcolm claimed the courthouse scene resulted from years of pressure and that he had needed a decisive way to make me accept his withdrawal. Priya answered without defending every choice I made. Naomi's pressure did not create Malcolm's paternity judgment. It did not cause the support order. It did not force him to write none, where a legally recognized child existed. It did not make him tell Marta he was certain when I was absent. It did not make him prepare a plan to shock me into signing an accusation before I read it. Jocelyn provided a supplemental declaration, stating Malcolm had never told her that I had advance notice of the withdrawal. He had told her the opposite. He said I already knew and had prepared Evie. Marta confirmed that Malcolm participated voluntarily in his private interview. She documented that he expressed a clear desire to adopt Evie and denied being pressured. Through counsel, Dana confirmed that Malcolm had used the same language about Nathan years earlier. He called him a child he never chose. She did not speculate about the adoption or my marriage. She supplied only the statement and its authenticated source. The record became less flattering to me and more difficult for Malcolm to dismiss. Priya said my willingness to disclose the complete chain strengthened my credibility. I did not feel strengthened. Evie still checked my answers for hidden endings. She still asked whether I knew more each time I explained a court development. Some nights, she chose to call Lorraine instead of talking to me. Honesty had not repaired the damage. It had only stopped me from adding another lie on top of it. The evening before Priya filed our materials for the continued hearing, I showed Evie the section of my declaration that concerned her. I did not show her Nathan's records or Jocelyn's private messages. You wrote that you used my disappointment, she said. Yes. Will Malcolm read this? Yes. Will the judge? Yes. Will people think you are a bad mother? Some may. She looked surprised by the answer. Are you scared? Yes. Then why are you sending it? Because I cannot ask the court to reject Malcolm's false version while hiding the parts of the truth that make me look bad. Evie handed the page back. I am still angry. I know. I do not forgive you yet. I know. She stood at the doorway, waiting as if there was one more answer she needed. I cannot promise what Malcolm will do, what the judge will decide, or when you will trust me again, I said. The only promises I have the right to make are about myself. I will stay, and I will tell you the truth, even when the truth makes me look worse. Evie did not come closer, but she did not walk away before I finished. On August 12th, I returned to the same courthouse where Evie had removed her daddy's girl badge. This time, she did not enter the courtroom. My mother, Lorraine, brought her to the supervised children's waiting area on another floor. Evie had chosen the arrangement herself. She knew Judge Stone would review the adoption record, but she did not want to see Malcolm or hear adults repeat what happened in the hallway. Before we separated near the security station, Evie handed Priya the short statement she had written. "Only if it is needed," she said. Priya accepted the sealed envelope without opening it. "You may change your mind at any point before it is submitted." "I know." Evie looked at me. "Do not tell him where I am." "I will not." Lorraine held out her hand. Evie took it, but before walking away she turned back. "Are you going to tell the whole truth?" "Yes." "Even your part?" "Yes." She nodded once and followed my mother toward the elevators. Malcolm arrived alone. Jocelyn was not with him. By then, she was nearly 34 weeks pregnant and communicating with him, mainly through her own attorney. Malcolm wore a dark suit and carried a narrow leather case. His face showed no sign that the last 3 months had changed anything. He greeted his lawyer, glanced at Priya, and looked directly at me. "Where is Evie?" I did not answer. His lawyer touched his arm and guided him toward their side of the courtroom. When Judge Maribel Stone entered, everyone stood. She took her seat and reviewed the file in silence. The original adoption petition rested beside Malcolm's request to withdraw, the unsigned joint declaration, Marta Bell's supplemental memorandum, and the later submissions from both sides. Judge Stone began by stating what the hearing was not. "This court is not here to compel Mr. Reed to adopt a child against his wishes." Malcolm sat straighter. His withdrawal of consent ended the possibility of finalizing this adoption. No court can require him to execute an agreement of adoption or assume a parental relationship he no longer accepts. I had known that for months, but hearing it in the courtroom still hurt. The law could recognize a parent. It could not manufacture one. Judge Stone continued. "The remaining issues are limited. The court must determine how the withdrawal is recorded, whether the proposed joint declaration reflects a genuine agreement, and whether the investigator's supplemental memorandum identifies inaccuracies that require correction or referral." She looked toward Malcolm. "Mr. Reed, do you continue to withdraw your consent?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Then the adoption will not be finalized." No one argued. Priya did not ask the judge to make Malcolm love Evie. She did not describe the badge, the bleeding pin, or the question Evie had forbidden us to use. She stood and placed the first document before the court. It was Malcolm's adoption petition. Priya read the section in which he described his relationship with Evie as permanent in every way except law. She showed the comments in the document history where he had strengthened the description of their father-child bond. Malcolm's attorney objected that people were allowed to change their minds. Judge Stone agreed. "The court has already acknowledged that right." Priya nodded. "We are not arguing that Mr. Reed was required to maintain his consent. We are addressing his claim that he never freely wanted the adoption and participated only because misquote. Carter supplied the answers and pressured him. She then referred to Marta's permitted interview summary. Marta had questioned Malcolm privately. I had not been in the room. Malcolm described school pickups, bedtime routines, art shows, and years of family life. He said he understood the permanence of adoption. When Marta asked directly whether anyone had pressured him, he said no. Malcolm leaned toward his attorney. His attorney argued that the interview reflected Malcolm's feelings at that time. Judge Stone looked over her glasses. Did Miss Carter attend that interview? No, Your Honor. Did she supply his answers from outside the room? No. The courtroom became quiet. Priya moved to the second set of documents. The paternity judgment and support records involving Nathan were submitted under seal with identifying information protected. Priya did not tell Nathan's story. She did not read his childhood letters or describe the games Malcolm missed. She stated only what the records proved. Malcolm's paternity had been legally established years before he filed the adoption petition. A support order existed. Current payments were being withheld from his wages. Arrears of $28,400 remained from an earlier period. Malcolm knew those facts when he entered none beside the questions asking about biological children and support obligations. His attorney argued that the old case had no bearing on whether Malcolm could form a relationship with Evie. Priya answered calmly. The issue is not whether the prior case disqualified him from adopting. The issue is whether it existed when he declared that it did not. Judge Stone turned to Malcolm. You have stated that the Sacramento matter was irrelevant. The form did not ask you to decide relevance. It asked whether another legally recognized child and support obligation existed. Malcolm folded his hands. I believe the question concerned children in my household. Judge Stone looked at the form. It asks for all biological, adopted, or legally recognized children. My attorney advised me on the submission. His lawyer's head moved slightly. Priya opened the version history. The earliest draft showed the question unanswered. A later version contained Malcolm's initials beside the comment "remove," not applicable. The final form contained none. Another file showed him revising the description of his relationship with Evie. The same person who made the fatherhood language stronger had removed the evidence that he was already a legal father. Malcolm's attorney requested that the court avoid drawing conclusions about intent from ordinary document editing. Judge Stone agreed that the hearing was not a criminal trial. I am not making a criminal finding, she said. I am determining whether the adoption record contains materially inconsistent sworn statements. Priya placed the joint declaration before the court. The document claimed I had initiated and maintained the adoption against Malcolm's uncertainty. It said I supplied the incorrect family history. It required me to confirm that Malcolm had hidden no material information. My signature line remained blank. Priya showed the creation date, May 4th. 11 days before Malcolm told me the hearing was proceeding normally. 2 weeks before he arrived with Jocelyn and handed me the paper. Malcolm's attorney said the declaration had been drafted as a precaution during a period of marital conflict. He argued that it was never intended for use unless the adoption became contentious. Priya then presented the authenticated message export provided by Jocelyn. The court had the complete relevant sequence, not only a screenshot. Malcolm wrote that he needed me emotional enough to sign before I started reading. He instructed Jocelyn not to argue with me. He told her to stand beside him and let the pregnancy make the point. Malcolm shifted in his chair. Those were private words written in anger, he said. Judge Stone looked at the date. The declaration was created 2 weeks before the hearing. Yes, and the messages discussing how to obtain Miss Carter's signature were sent before the hearing. Yes, but I was angry about the pressure she had placed on me. Anger may explain tone. It does not explain why the document was prepared in advance while you continued assuring the petitioner that the hearing would proceed. Malcolm looked at his lawyer. My family, law attorney, drafted the language. I signed what I was given. Priya returned to the edit history. The file contained Malcolm's comments beside the sections assigning responsibility to me. He asked for clearer separation from the representations in the original petition. He requested stronger language, stating that the adoption had been my initiative. Judge Stone read the comments silently. You did not merely receive a completed document, she said. I made suggestions based on legal advice. You contributed to the wording. Yes. The answer came quietly. Then it was my turn. Priya asked me to state my name and relationship to Evie. She asked whether I had encouraged Malcolm to complete the adoption. Yes. Did you remind him of promises he made to Evie? Yes. Did you use Evie's disappointment in arguments with him? Yes. Did you hope her presence at the final hearing would make him follow through? My hands tightened in my lap. Yes. Malcolm's attorney stood for cross-examination. You knew my client was hesitant. I knew he delayed. You knew he was uncomfortable with the investigation into his past. Yes. You still told your daughter the adoption was certain. Yes. You brought her to court wearing a badge designed to pressure him emotionally. No. You allowed her to wear it. Yes. You expected him to see it. Yes. And you believed seeing her hope would make it harder for him to withdraw. Yes. His attorney paused, perhaps expecting me to resist. I did not. You used your daughter's fear of abandonment to keep my client in the adoption process. I used her disappointment in arguments with him, and I was wrong. Malcolm looked toward me. His attorney continued. So the courthouse scene was the predictable result of your pressure. No. You have admitted you pressured him. I pressured a man who repeatedly said he wanted to adopt my daughter and needed more time. I did not tell him to conceal a son, enter false information, prepare a declaration blaming me, or plan to shock me into signing it. You brought Evie there. Yes, that was my mistake. You created the emotional circumstances. I created expectations I should not have created. Malcolm chose how to break them. His attorney asked whether I had completed any portion of the family history forms. I provided my history and Evie's. Malcolm completed his own history. Did you review his answers? Not carefully enough. Then you participated in submitting inaccurate information. I trusted his statement that he had no other child or support obligation. I did not know Nathan existed. Is that because you did not ask? I asked about the old dispute. I accepted a vague answer. That was careless. It did not make the answer true. The attorney returned to his table. Priya asked one final question. Are you asking this court to find that you made no mistakes? No. What are you asking the court to record? That the adoption ended because Malcolm withdrew his consent, not because Evie did something wrong, not because I invented his family history, and not because an unsigned declaration represents an agreement I never made. Priya sat down. Judge Stone reviewed the filings for several minutes. Evie's sealed statement remained beside Priya. She had authorized its use only if the court needed confirmation of her wishes. Priya decided the adult record was enough. The envelope stayed closed. Judge Stone issued a minute order from the bench, with a written version to follow. The adoption petition would be closed without finalization because Malcolm Adrian Reed had unilaterally withdrawn his consent. The unsigned joint declaration would not be accepted as a joint statement. The record contained no finding that I had supplied Malcolm's undisclosed paternity information. It contained no finding that Evie had caused the withdrawal through any behavior or statement. The court would preserve the relevant documents and permit limited referral of the inconsistent declarations to the appropriate review authorities. The portion concerning Nathan's support obligation could be provided through proper procedure to authorized Sacramento Child Support Council. Judge Stone did not determine whether Malcolm had committed a crime. She did not calculate his arrears. She did not divide our townhouse, decide the divorce, or punish him for refusing to adopt. No officers entered, no handcuffs appeared. The consequences moved into the systems that actually had authority to examine them. Malcolm had not lost everything. He had lost control of the record. Outside the courtroom, Priya asked me to wait while she spoke with the clerk about the sealed exhibits. I walked toward the public elevators alone. Malcolm followed. We can still repair some of this, he said. I kept walking. I never wanted Evie hurt. You planned the scene. I planned to end an impossible situation. You used her to make me sign. You used her first. I stopped. The old version of me would have argued that my intentions were better. I would have demanded that he admit our choices were not equal. Instead, I said, I have admitted what I did to her. His expression changed. And now you think that makes you noble? No. Then stop acting as though you have the right to keep her from me. She does not want contact. She is 9. You are making that decision. She made it herself. You coached her to say that. She removed the pin from her badge because she did not want it to hurt her again. I did not tell her to do that. Malcolm stepped closer. If you convince her to talk to me, I will cooperate on the house. I can make the divorce easier. I can explain that the courthouse got out of control. You still think access to Evie is something we trade. I was her father for 6 years. When it suited you, his jaw tightened. I am offering to repair the relationship. Evie is not a reward for your cooperation. The elevator doors opened. Lorraine stood inside with Evie beside her. My daughter wore jeans and a yellow shirt from the studio. Her hair was tied back. She held no folder, no practiced signatures, and no badge. Malcolm saw her. Evie. She heard him. I knew, because her shoulders rose slightly. She did not turn around. Lorraine placed one hand between Evie's shoulder blades and walked with her toward me. Malcolm called again. Evie, I only want to talk. She continued walking. I did not tell her to ignore him. I did not tell her to answer. The choice remained hers. When she reached me, she took my hand. We entered the elevator together. Lorraine stood on Evie's other side. Malcolm remained in the hallway as the doors closed. In the parking garage, Evie waited until Lorraine had walked several steps ahead. Did the judge make him my dad? No. Could she? No one could force him to adopt you. Evie looked down at our joined hands. Can a court give me a different dad? I chose my words carefully. A court can create a legal parent-child relationship when the right person freely chooses that responsibility. But can it make someone stay? No. The answer hurt, but it did not hide anything. A court can recognize a parent, I said. It cannot create a person who will choose to stay. By December 5th, the first draft of the school exhibition label still said Evie Reed. Mrs. Tan held it between 2 fingers, while Evie stood beside a row of paintings in the elementary school gym. The label had been prepared months earlier, before the adoption hearing, when Evie believed Malcolm's name would become hers. Her legal name had never changed. The school records still said Evie Carter. Only the display card had been saved in a folder after the hearing because Mrs. Tan did not want to destroy something without asking her. Now she placed 2 blank cards on the table. We can use Carter, she said. Or you can write whatever name you want displayed, as long as it is still connected to your school record. Mrs. Tan looked at Evie, not me. I kept my hands at my sides. 6 months earlier, I would have answered before my daughter could feel uncertain. I would have said Carter was safer, stronger, or more honest. I would have tried to protect her from choosing the wrong symbol. That morning I waited. Evie picked up a black marker. She wrote slowly, forming each letter with the same care she had once used to practice Malcolm's name 53 times. Evie Carter. Mrs. Tan smiled. Is that the one? Evie looked at the card. I want the name that stayed. She did not say it angrily. She said it as though she had finally separated a fact from a wish. Mrs. Tan placed the label beneath Evie's painting. She slipped the old Evie Reed draft into Evie's portfolio instead of throwing it away. You can decide what happens to this one too, she said. Evie carried both names home. The artwork showed 3 doors. One stood open, one was closed. The third had no handle on the outside. When I asked about it later, Evie told me the first door belonged to people who welcomed you. The second belonged to people who wanted privacy. The third belonged to people who wanted to control who could enter, while keeping everyone else trapped inside. She did not say which door represented Malcolm. She did not need to. Our divorce had moved much more slowly than the adoption hearing. I filed on May 20th. Malcolm was served 2 days later. No amount of betrayal shortened California's waiting period, or turned the end of a marriage into an instant judgment. Temporary orders addressed the townhouse, mortgage payments, and unusual financial transfers, while both sides completed disclosures. Malcolm could not empty shared accounts without explanation. I could not treat the townhouse or studio as though the marriage had never existed. Carter Community Art Studio remained the company I had formed before the marriage, but the lawyers still reviewed income and marital contributions made during the years Malcolm and I were together. The townhouse was more difficult. Neither of us could comfortably carry the mortgage alone. After months of figures, appraisals, and negotiations, we agreed it would be sold if refinancing into one name could not be completed on acceptable terms. I had once believed keeping the house was the same as keeping Evie safe. Therapy taught me to separate stability from a particular building. A bedroom did not become secure because the same walls surrounded it. It became secure when a child knew no one would use housing, affection, or belonging to control her. By late November, after the minimum 6-month period had passed and the required disclosures were completed, the judgment ending our marital status was entered. Several financial details continued through the agreed process, but I was no longer Malcolm's wife. There was no courtroom celebration. Priya emailed the notice. I read it at my desk in the studio between an unpaid invoice and a registration form for a Saturday painting class. I printed one copy for my records and returned to work. The Sacramento child support matter continued separately. Judge Stone had not calculated Malcolm's arrears. She had not ordered him to pay Nathan. The authorized records went through the proper channels, and the Sacramento Child Support Agency confirmed the existing balance. The arrears remained approximately $28,400. A supplemental payment arrangement was added alongside the wage withholding already covering current support. There were no officers waiting outside Malcolm's office. He did not lose his job overnight. He did not become homeless or disappear into prison. He became responsible for obligations that had existed long before he admitted them. That consequence suited him more accurately than a dramatic collapse would have. Malcolm had spent years treating responsibility as something that became real only when another person forced it onto paper. Now the papers remained whether he liked them or not. Nathan did not meet him. Dana told Priya that Nathan wanted to concentrate on 11th grade, his weekend job at the bicycle repair shop, and the parts of his life that did not involve his father. He did not want an apology meeting. He did not want to appear in our story. When Malcolm sent him a letter through the approved channel, Nathan chose not to read it. Dana did not call that cruel. She called it his decision. Malcolm sent a letter to Evie too. The envelope arrived through his attorney. Her full legal name was typed across the front, Evie Carter. I placed it unopened on the kitchen table. You can read it now, later, or never, I told her. Did you read it? No. Do you want me to? My feelings do not decide that. She turned the envelope over. Malcolm's return address appeared in the corner. Will he know if I do not open it? I do not know. Will you tell him? Not unless a legal reason requires an answer. She carried the envelope to her room. That evening, she brought it back downstairs and placed it inside a desk drawer. I am not reading it yet. All right. What if I never do? Then you never do. She watched my face for disappointment. I gave her none. Refusing a letter was not bitterness. It was not proof she had failed to heal. Forgiveness was not an assignment she owed Malcolm so adults could call the ending beautiful. Jocelyn gave birth to a baby boy on September 20th, one day before her original due date. She did not move in with Malcolm. Through her attorney, she began the process of establishing parentage, support, pregnancy-related expenses, and a future parenting schedule. She no longer relied on his promise that they could handle everything privately. Several weeks after the birth, she sent me a short email. I knew Evie would be there, and I came anyway. I believed what Malcolm told me because it gave me what I wanted. I am sorry for helping him hurt her. There was no request that I respond. I read the message once and saved it with the other records. I did not forgive Jocelyn simply because motherhood had made the danger clearer to her. She had been pregnant when she stood in the courthouse hallway. She already understood that children could be harmed by adult choices. Her apology acknowledged the truth. it did not create a relationship between us. The studio survived, though it no longer looked exactly as it had before the hearing. 2 pottery wheels were gone. The large city mural contract went to another organization. I continued teaching one adult class online and kept the combined after-school groups because the smaller schedule was easier to manage. No wealthy stranger arrived with a check. No hidden investor saved the business. Parents enrolled their children. A grandmother paid for 2 extra places in the winter program and asked that they be offered anonymously to families who needed them. Several former students returned for weekend workshops. Mrs. Tan arranged for the school to partner with us on the December exhibition. The community did not rescue me from every consequence. It kept showing up. That difference mattered. The studio's annual revenue would be lower. My income was less predictable. Priya's payment plan remained taped inside a folder in my desk. But the light stayed on. Children still left fingerprints in paint trays. Brushes still dried, crooked in jars. Evie still sat at the largest work table after school, though she no longer practiced anyone else's last name. Therapy continued too. Some sessions felt useful. Others ended with both of us frustrated. Evie still asked whether I knew more than I had told her whenever a letter or legal email arrived. Sometimes I answered too quickly, and she asked me to start again. Doctor. Ortiz taught us to separate reassurance from information. When Evie asked whether we would have to move after the townhouse was sold, I did not say everything would be fine. I said I was reviewing apartments near her school and would show her the choices before signing a lease. When she asked whether Malcolm might return to court, I did not say he could never hurt us again. I said any request would go through the legal process, and she would not be surprised by a meeting I had secretly arranged. When she asked whether I would ever marry again, I did not promise that no man would enter our lives. I said I was not looking for anyone, and would never give another person a parental role before their actions earned trust. Some nights, Evie still came into my room to see whether I was awake. During the first month after the hearing, she checked almost every night. She rarely asked for anything. She stood near the door until I spoke. I am here. By November, the visits became less frequent. One morning, I realized an entire week had passed without her checking. I did not mention it. Healing became easier when I stopped measuring it aloud. After the school exhibition, we returned to the studio, carrying Evie's painting and the display label she had written. She placed Evie Carter on the corkboard above her work table. Then she opened the bottom drawer. The face of the old Daddy's Girl badge rested inside. The bent pin was gone. Without the metal backing, it looked less like something meant to be worn, and more like a small piece of painted paper. Evie carried it to the supply cabinet and took down a wooden memory box. The box contained a hospital bracelet from when she broke her wrist, a faded ribbon from her first art show, a postcard from a teacher who moved away, and the original draft label that said Evie Reed. Each object had once belonged to a version of her life that mattered, even if it no longer defined her. "Do you want me to leave?" I asked. "No." She placed the badge inside the box. "You are not throwing it away?" "It mattered when I made it." "Yes." "It does not mean the same thing now." "No." She closed the lid. For months, I had imagined healing would require destroying the badge. I thought she might tear it, burn it, or throw it into the trash with Malcolm's letter. Evie chose something quieter. She allowed the object to belong to her past without allowing it to define her future. Then she cut a circle from thick cardstock. She painted the center deep blue and added a thin silver border. I expected her to write Mommy's Girl. Part of me wanted that replacement because it would place me where Malcolm had failed. But replacing one identity with another would still ask Evie to define herself through an adult. She wrote 4 words. "I choose my name." Beneath them, she painted a small open door. When the paint dried, she attached a safe plastic clip instead of a sharp pin. She held the badge against her shirt and looked at me. "Is it too much?" The question was the same one she had asked on the morning of the adoption hearing. This time, I did not tell her what the badge should mean to someone else. Does it say what you want? Yes. Then it is enough. She clipped it to her shirt. At home that night, the townhouse felt temporary. Several shelves were already empty because I had begun packing books we did not use every day. A folder of apartment listings sat on the counter. Evie walked through the rooms without asking whether packing meant I might leave her behind. She stopped beside the refrigerator. The original practice sheet was still stored in a kitchen drawer. She asked me to take it out. 53 versions of Evie Reed covered the page. She studied them without crying. Then she turned the paper over and wrote one name on the blank side. Evie Carter. Do you want to keep both sides? I asked. Yes. Why? Because I really wanted that name then. She pointed to Reed. And I really want this one now. She pointed to Carter. Both things can be true. I placed the page inside a clear sleeve. For most of my life, I had believed a good mother prevented pain. When I could not prevent it, I tried to soften the truth until the danger disappeared behind nicer words. That was how I helped build the promise that broke Evie in the courthouse hallway. I could not guarantee she would never be abandoned again. I could not promise every adult would tell her the truth. I could not give her a father by choosing harder, hoping longer, or arranging the perfect legal ceremony. What I could do was refuse to hide warning signs from her. I could stop asking her pain to hold other people in place. I could remain beside her when the truth was painful without changing it into something prettier. Before bed, Evie placed her new badge on the dresser. The unopened letter from Malcolm remained in the drawer. The memory box remained closed. None of those objects demanded an answer that night. At her doorway, I told her I loved her. I know, she said. Then she added, You are still here. Yes. Malcolm had called blood the proof that a child was real. But the name Evie chose belonged to the person who stayed, told the truth, and never again asked her to earn a place in someone else's family. That was when I finally understood that a family is not completed by the person who signs. It is protected by the people who remain responsible after the promises are over.